Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's town board meeting for November 8th, 2022. If you could please stand with me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Clerk, can you call the roll, please?
Mayor Pro Tem Gray.
Here.
Trustee Hardy.
Yes.
Trustee Sorcelli.
Here.
Trustee Ayers.
Here.
Trustee Butler.
Here.
Trustee Murphy has not yet arrived.
Okay. Up next is citizen participation. This is for people in the audience who would like to speak to something that is not on the agenda this evening. All right, looks like we have Sir Lincoln and Butch Haas, if you guys wanted to come on up. Try to keep comments to 3 minutes.
Okay, well, this is our two-weekly update, I guess to call it. We come in every meeting, give you an update on what's going on with the town purchase of Newell Farm.
Do we need to say our name and address?
Butch Haas, 236 East Highway 56.
Sarah Lincoln, same address.
All right. So since the October 25th meeting, due diligence on the water share is complete. Per November 1st letter from Ken Matthews, president of Loveland Lake and Ditch. So that's done. Attorney Smith and our attorney agreed on the use and occupancy agreement today. That's huge.
That's the Reservation of Life Estate.
So we'll be putting the finishing touches on that unless Chris has any additional input once he sees all that. And that's good to have that behind us. And Jonathan, forgive me if I pronounce his name wrong, Gesick?
Jonathan Giesing.
Giesing. And also Brian, I'll say Dubois.
It's Du Bois.
Is he from
It's
Wyoming?
the American version of it's Iowan.
Well, I was gonna say Du Bois because, you know, being Wyoming. Anyway, they came out today, did the home inspection, and neither one of them fell or got hurt or anything, so that's good. And so the only thing we're waiting on right now is a red line on the mineral rights portion of the special warranty deed. Aaron had a question for our attorney today, so I assume they'll get that all hammered out.
So as far as next steps go, November 22nd, as we've been saying for a few weeks, is a big day. We've all been working toward that. There's a lot of deliverables due, and it looks like we're on track to do that. That's 2 weeks. So it looks like we're on track. The next big day is December 2nd. That's when the Reservation of Life Estate was due. And it looks like we're way ahead of schedule on that, so that's good. And then there are a couple of other things due that day, such as the objection to the home inspection, you know, those kinds of things. So that's December 2nd, and then December 22nd is when all the due diligence needs to be wrapped up and done. So, you know, that's what we're shooting toward, and the closing would be January 2nd.
We did notice that January 2nd is the Monday after New Year's Day. Will anyone be open that day?
We will be open that day.
Okay.
Okay, but banks, that kind of thing, are they gonna be open?
It's a good question.
Okay, well,
All right.
we'll play that as it goes.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Seeing no one else signing up, is there anybody in the audience who didn't get a chance to sign up that would like to speak to any items? No, seeing none. Anybody online?
No, there's not.
Okay, guess we'll close citizen participation and move on to the consent agenda. Do any of the trustees want anything discussed about, or is there a motion to approve?
Mayor Pro Tem Grace, if I could, this is not on the consent agenda, but we do have a specific motion for you in the consent agenda in your motion sheet. And that is to approve the agenda, specifically and the consent agenda with the items listed. So there was information in your packet that was not part of the agenda itself. And we're not asking you to make a decision on tonight, so just want to be clear about that.
Okay.
And then also as a bit of information, there's a clerical discrepancy on the agenda, on the agenda itself, on the dates and all the board memos, on the date on the website, social media posts, all November 8th. There's one spot on the agenda where it says November 11th. in an abundance of caution, we think that it would be appropriate for the family resolution item to be, the public testimony to be continued to the next meeting on November 22nd, just in case there was an employee who was misunderstood that our regular meeting date was not Tuesday, December 11th, which is not an actual date.
Okay.
So while all the other dates are correct everywhere else in the agenda, there's one spot. Just wanna be sure that we're good there.
Sure. So the family and medical leave insurance sector, we are just gonna skip that.
Continue public testimony to the next meeting.
Okay.
We'll go ahead and talk about it tonight.
Understood. So we will open up public
And take
comment.
testimony tonight for anybody that is here, but then we'd also continue that to the next meeting.
Okay, so we'd open public comment and then leave that open, but move on to the next piece. Okay. Okay.
Sorry, so just that little bit of clarification for all of you.
Sure. Okay. Anybody on the board want to
I'll do it.
Okay.
I move to combine and approve all items on the consent agenda as listed on the meeting agenda.
Okay, we have trustee Hardy with the motion. Is there anybody with a second?
I'll second.
All right, trustee Butler with a second. Clerk, can we get a roll call vote?
Trustee Ayers,
Yes.
trustee Murphy,
Yes.
trustee Sorcelli,
Yes.
trustee Hardy,
Yes.
trustee Butler,
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem Gray.
Yes, all right. Moving on from consent agenda, we have the park hours introduction presented by Sergeant Anderson is up next.
Good evening, trustees, Mayor Pro Tem. There's a couple of reasons why I'm bringing this up to the board tonight. We've had a couple of issues that have come up. One being, we've had a few transients using the trees under the trees at Fickle Park as their residence. There's been a lot of trash, other things left that aren't appropriate to say. That we need to have some kind of understanding that we can enforce them not to be there at night. But what brought this whole thing up to light was we had a gentleman that was using the bathrooms over at Pioneer Park as his own residence. He would go in at night, bring his hot plate, set up his own little house in there. He had running water, he had a restroom, and he had a cooking facility. And he would leave in the mornings. The only reason we found this out was someone went over there early in the morning and found him in there cooking some eggs. So we looked at the ordinances that we had, and we had nothing to enforce. Most areas have signs up, most of the parks have signs dusk to dawn, but that doesn't do anything for us if we don't have an ordinance to follow. So we created this ordinance where we were going to be able to enforce people not using the park in those manners. We hashed on times. Trouble is times change with our daylight savings, so it was just messing things up, and it worked better if we went with dusk to dawn. Cause that goes with the day hours. So we bring this to you to look at and approve. Tonight, I guess it's just first reading, but I would like you to look at it and discuss it and look at the viability for us to be able to enforce people not using the parks at night.
Okay.
Any questions?
Yes. With the new installation of the bathrooms going at Fickle Park and the Pioneer Park bathrooms, do we have any sort of smart lock systems on those so that we can time them to be locked and unlocked?
Actually, the new one in Fickle Park I know does.
Okay.
The Pioneer Park restrooms were not installed with those back whenever they were installed 10 years ago or however long it's been. But the new restroom at Fickle Park does have timed locks on it.
Other question is I know that we had things in our ordinance about regarding transients and homelessness, how has this passed that test for the NAACP stuff we don't?
Actually, we haven't had really any pushback from any of the transients that have walked through town. We just talk to them a little bit and they decide, well, I'm gonna go find another place to live. Is that what you're talking about?
No, mine was more about when all these cities across the state were being sued for policies and ordinances that they had in their books that were basically, I remember we had a meeting where we had to remove some verbiage out of our policies or ordinances.
I think what you're discussing is like a no camping ordinance.
Yeah, things along those
And what
lines.
we're talking about is just a limit on park hours.
Okay.
When you're allowed.
Yeah, it's because of what has happened, but it's not targeted for
Okay.
just that population. We could have teenagers having a wild time in the park, we can be able to go over there and say, hey, you guys can't be here.
Yeah, I just don't want it to be interpreted as something as being an anti-homelessness thing.
No, this has nothing to do with
Yeah.
the transient population or them coming into town. It's just using the park during the night hours.
Okay.
That's all that is.
Any other questions?
How will you enforce it? What will be the consequences if a person chooses not to leave the premises?
If they refuse, we can issue the summons, or they would have to appear in court. There's not gonna be a fine schedule on that. That would have to go to the judge and let him make that determination.
Would that be trespassing then? Or
It's basically trespassing is what it is, but it's going against the hours.
Okay.
So,
I know there's a lot of people like in the summer hours that walk their dogs and stuff at night through our parks. Do you see that conflicting with this ordinance, that people won't be allowed to go through the parks at night, or I just see that being a little challenging to monitor?
I think it's more, we're gonna be able to use discretion. You know, if someone's using the park to walk the dog, throw the ball a little bit. It's more for the ones that we're gonna have problems with, like the kids showing up and just having a gay old time in the middle of the night. Besides curfew, we have that to go with too. We just wanna avoid any damages, any criminal mischief, anything like that happens usually at night.
Trustee Aaron?
Yeah, I just have the same basic question, right? If this is going to be discretionary for you guys to be able to enforce it depending on the situation, I just wanna make sure that the town and law enforcement is not going to be seen as sort of picking which people to approach and to contact about being in the park, right? So if someone wants to go throw the frisbee in the middle of the night, if they have a glow in the dark frisbee, if they're not causing a problem, that's up to the discretion of the officer.
Yes.
Okay.
Sleeping under the trees, that's a problem. It really is. We wanna make sure that the park stays safe. Somebody walking their dog is walking by somebody that's sleeping under the tree, that's not safe. That's what we're looking for. We're looking for more of the safety and the lack of ability to be able to go cause damage. So, does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Question on the timing, you said you kind of discussed, different options, landed on the dusk till dawn. Guess a little more just clarification with that. Cause we just had time change, it's getting dark pretty early. I live in a community, Collins Park, we have actually a town park right in the middle of our neighborhood. Even driving here, there was a handful of my neighbors just out walking their dogs, which they do nightly in the park, but when it gets dark at 5 o'clock, that's, people aren't even home from work yet, so why not do at 10 PM or midnight? Why did you decide the dusk till dawn?
Because of the hours that do change. It wouldn't be consistent with the time change, because you'd have 6 o'clock tonight, and then summer, 6 o'clock's gonna be right in the middle of the afternoon, actually. It's gonna be pretty bright. So we wanted to go with basically sundown to sunup. That's when the darkness starts coming, and that's when we start having troubles. If they're walking their dogs, that's not an issue. It really is not. That's not what this whole thing is about.
Well, I understand. I guess to maybe trustee Ayers and Sorcelli's comments, I'm just thinking through that we're seen as consistent, to me, the judicial, enforcing laws, I understand you wanna use discretion, I get that, in a perfect world that works. But I'm just hypothetically, I don't want, someone that you issue citation or summons to then, show up the next day and show proof that, look, we've got, other people using the park after dark hours, that's quote against the law, and, I just want there to be some, I guess, what's the word? Just consistency, I guess, with it, that we can, as a town, feel confident or comfortable enforcing.
It's why they're in the park, though. That's what the whole concern is why are you in this park? If you're here to walk your dog, hallelujah. If you're here to sleep or use the bathroom as a residence or cause damage or just cause noise, that's when it's a problem. So if somebody gets a ticket, the judge, and I've already talked with the prosecuting attorney who will request this, is the judge needs to say, why were you in the park? And if they have a good explanation, we'll leave that up to the judge. But for our discretion is, if it is not for just a community benefit, like walking the dog, just walking, it doesn't have to be a dog, you can be pushing a stroller, it doesn't matter.
Sure.
And for clarity, the ordinance specifically exempts walking through the park. So sidewalks, trails, walking through the park, it is not prohibited under the ordinance. So,
Okay.
playing on the playground after dark, whatever, that kind of stuff is different.
Trustee
But
Murphy.
those things, walking through the park, on a sidewalk or trail with a dog, specifically not prohibited in the ordinance.
Okay, thank you.
Just for staff, regarding this ordinance, good example of a special case would be the skate park right now. Was just out there a few minutes ago. It's lit, it's being properly used, it's obviously after dark. Can we appropriately carve out those special uses?
Yeah, so the ordinance specifically says that unless, the hours are dusk to dawn unless different hours are established and posted on the premises.
And that's what
So
I'm
we
asking.
would then
Can we
establish
follow?
hours on those premises where we would expect people to be after dark, because we've lit them appropriately and that's what they're there for.
Cause I believe right now, like Fickle Park, there's signs on the light posts that says dawn to dusk.
There is, and I
Already.
It
think
is, but
there
that's the
there already
only,
are, there has been, that's always been our policy, we just don't have an ordinance in place to enforce that. So again, the ordinance would establish that it'd be dusk to dawn unless it's posted appropriately.
So the signs became before the ordinance. Chicken before the egg.
it should be the other way around.
Trustee Yurchev?
Yeah, so I don't wanna belabor the point, but I'm kind of worried about feedback and optics of the possibilities, right? And so if you focus, not you, right, but if one were to focus on walking through the park or some activity, well, now I'm concerned that if someone who is just using the park to sit there for a quiet reason, right? They're up to no good, they're not trying to spend the night there, they're not trying to use it as a home one way or another. Well, that seems to me to move towards a charge of loitering or a possible charge of loitering. Because if it's up to the discretion of the person who contacts them, if they ask, why are you here? I'm just sitting here, well, that's not really a justifiable quote unquote reason to be there, but they are just using the park to sit and have a quiet place. And so I'm concerned that the language of the ordinance is a little broad, and I understand why it needs to be broad so that that case by case basis can come in. I'm just worried that this is going to cause issues with community members who aren't necessarily there to, once again, quote unquote, do something in the park, if that makes sense.
If I may, I think the ordinance is specific in that basically everything in the park after dark is prohibited except walking through. using the trails or sidewalks or walking through the park. And so, you know, in that way, I think that ordinance is generally specific. I think the real question becomes, does the board wanna prohibit folks from being in the park after dark? And if the answer is no, then that's fine. If the answer is yes, it's very hard to come up with a very specific list of reasons you can be there. The easiest thing to police, from my perspective, I think from the chiefs, is are you using the trails or sidewalks, or are you walking through the park? In which case you're not in violation of the ordinance. If you're doing anything else in there after dark, you are. Otherwise, we have to come up with a list of like every possible thing you could do in the park, and that would be pretty tough. And so,
Would be sitting on the bench next to the sidewalk be considered using the sidewalk and trail?
yeah, I mean, that's,
Right, and that's my concern, right? I don't disagree with the ordinance itself per se, but my concern is that it's going to look bad and possibly incur legal action if people are calling out officers or enforcers for picking on them, right? Because as someone said earlier, well, I was in the park, they were in the park, they didn't get in trouble, and we were both there after dark, and if it's up to the discretion of the contacting officer or deputy, I can foresee that being I guess a legal issue.
Falls under the guidance of profiling.
Let me bring up a little bit of history. Berthoud is the only town in Larimer County that does not have an hour usage of a park. The tighter you make an ordinance, the more chances you're gonna have for some kind of litigation.
Yeah.
Okay, so you have to make it broad, but it doesn't have to be, this is the way it is. And that's why we did with the signs, because we talked about people that wanna go to the pickle park. Pickle court. Doggone it, pickleball court.
Right, to you too.
Yes.
So that 3 times
You
fast.
know, and we understand that, we understand that fully. We understand the dog walking, we understand just walking. You know, people don't get home right at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Sometimes they get home late, they have supper, they go for a walk. No problem, no problem whatsoever. It's the ones that are doing anything other than those kind of activities.
and I think the discretion is involved in like, you know, if there's somebody sitting on the bench and an officer goes into the park and says, hey, heads up, you know, we have a town ordinance that says you can't hang out in the park after dark. You are absolutely allowed to walk through, but you can't sit and hang out. The officer doesn't have to issue them a ticket, right? There's some discretion involved with like, you are clearly in violation of the ordinance, but there's some reasonableness, right? You know, if you're vandalizing the bathroom when they show up, they can just issue you a ticket because you weren't supposed to be there in the first place, right? So I think the discretion is in the application or the enforcement within some reason, right? But not so much on the like, is what you're doing okay or not? The discretion is, do I need to give you a ticket for it or not, right?
And if they're just sitting there and I go up there and say, you know, what are you doing? Oh, I'm just hanging out. Well, the park does close at dusk. Most people are gonna say, oh, all right, I understand that, adios. That's not a problem. I mean, if they're gonna go into some kind of a dissertation of why they have the right and blah, 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 we don't have to worry about that. As long as they're not causing any problems. Sometimes it's better just to walk away. And we have that discretion. By leaving it so broad as we did, it does give us that discretion. We don't have to be picking on certain things. But there are some things that we need to have that bite to be able to enforce it, to keep the park safe and clean.
It's giving you a tooth to enforce it rather than teeth.
It's not really that different than a speeding limit, right? I mean, maybe we've all been pulled over for going 5 over and the officer asked us to slow down, let us go, right?
Who does 5 over?
There's some discretion involved in whether or not they need to issue a ticket in that condition, right? When you're going 30 over in a school zone, you're getting a ticket, right? I mean, so there's always discretion involved in the application of the law, I think.
Well, and I appreciate the wording in the ordinance where it says that it finds this ordinance necessary for the health, safety, and welfare of the public. So we know that when the discretion's being used, it's running through that filter. Is it affecting health, safety, and wellness? So I think that helps give us the premise of knowing, okay, those are the things you're looking for as concerns for enforcing it with somebody, not just picking on anybody, but is it causing a concern? And
Yes.
everything in your job you have to use discretion on, right? Like that's normal for you. We just don't always have to think in those terms, so it helps us to have the buffers.
That's right.
So thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else on the board have any questions?
Oh, got a quick one.
Yeah.
What would it take to add appropriate signage to notify the public at each one of our parks?
It's already in Fickle.
Yeah, nothing, it just takes us to do it once you adopt the ordinance. So we have the budget available and can post them when the ordinance is adopted.
Hypothetically, if this were to essentially go through as is, in theory, with signage and this being put in place, could this be taken care of by beginning 2023? Hypothetically?
So ordinances aren't effective until 30 days after they're adopted.
Okay.
So assuming that you adopted it at the November 22nd meeting,
Right.
it would be effective 30 days later.
Okay.
I guess I have some concern
30 days
about
after publication.
when we were putting up signs and things like that, how it's going to make the public feel about using their spaces. If it's gonna make them feel unwelcome in those spaces or like they're gonna get in trouble for walking their dog or that kind of thing, right? If they don't understand, so
I think,
I don't wanna be heavy-handed with the
the ordinance, I think the
signage,
signage would be
like-
clear that, walking through the park, utilizing sidewalks, trails, and walking through the park is allowed use. All other activities in the park are prohibited between dusk and dawn. That's basically what the signs will say. So,
I can't
And I
remember
think
the
there's-
exact verbiage of the ones that are in Fickle, cause I walk by those signs all the time, but it just basically says park is open, dusk to dawn.
I think we just add that clarification so there's no question about, it's okay to walk through the park. If you wanna walk your dog through the park, that's fine.
And the signage isn't gonna be vicious, like it's not gonna achtung. It's just to say, hey, you're free to use this, cause this is something that we understand that this is what you wanna use. And if we go into too much signage, it's gonna start cluttering everything. But I think it would be mostly beneficial if we put the signs up into the certain places and then advertise this. I'll get with Becky, with the surveyor, and make sure that we get that added, and we have to do that anyway. And I'll make sure that she puts an article in there supporting this and kind of giving the public an idea of what we're looking for.
Well, the signs I've seen are posted pretty high, so they're not like down in your face, but they're there, they're just higher up, so you're aware. So it's kinda like, yeah, but.
And I will
Wow.
say, I'm not aware of any complaint we've ever received about the signs saying that the park is closed from dawn to dusk, that they're there now, but we do get complaints about people being in the park after dark on a regular basis. If that flips as a result of this ordinance, we'd be sure to let you know and talk about whether or not that's appropriate. But again, the complaints we get are not about our current signs that say the park's closed from dawn to dusk. But we do regularly get complaints about people being there that probably shouldn't be.
Any other questions or no?
No.
Alright,
I was just trying to ask the important ones, but
Yeah.
I'm sure it's already been taken care of, but it's our jobs to ask them anyway
yeah,
and
it is,
get
this is true.
clarification.
Yeah. Okay, I guess bring up, how does everybody feel about it so far? What like, dislike, change?
I think it's common practice in most places, like Jim said, we're like only park that doesn't have it,
Sure,
because we've been Mayberry, but
sure. Christopher,
But we're
your
getting
thoughts?
bigger and more
Keep
people.
it, change it.
Feel the same, as long as we have appropriate signage that's coordinated between Larimer County Sheriff's Department and town staff.
Perfect.
Yeah, same way. Once again, I wasn't necessarily against it. I just wanted some clarification as to why things were worded that way and what the consequences were, so.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I personally appreciate the being proactive in addressing the safety concerns if we're starting to see them. And it just makes me think that I would like to see what some of those numbers are as things happen and transpire in town when those concerns start to come up as our little town grows. It will be helpful for us to know kind of what the state, the situation is with more transient and homeless populations in town, so
And we do have more parks coming too, so.
many more to come. Thank you.
Trustee Butler, anything you wanna add to it?
Yeah, I support this. I mean, obviously, we're overdue to probably put something like this in place. And with more parks coming, I was thinking the same thing, it's more necessary.
Totally. No, to kind of echo everybody else, it all does come down a lot of the officer discretion. I think it also mostly just comes down to appropriate use of the park, to your point. Walking through it, playing in it, that's the whole point of having a park. Sleeping in it, making exit easy in it, less the use of a park and something else. So,
Correct.
Yeah,
If you're supposed to be using it, it'll be lit up.
yeah, exactly. Alright. Is that appropriate direction for staff regarding this topic?
Yeah, we'll bring it back to you on November 22nd for possible adoption.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. All right, moving on to item number 3, family and medical leave insurance opt-out. This one, we will open up the public section of the hearing, but we will not officially close it and readdress this at a known future meeting on the 22nd of November. But this will be introduced by our own Cindy Leach.
And just to clarify, this is not a public hearing like you're accustomed to.
Sure.
The law does require us to take public testimony.
Gotcha.
It's a little different.
Okay.
Where's the slideshow? It's not that one.
That's 2 items ahead. We can just jump right on the budget and bypass everything else.
All right.
We got you.
We just wanted to see how long we could make Cindy stay at the podium.
Nothing funner than dead air,
Don't
I'll
make
tell
me
you that
start
much.
doing karaoke.
Sure.
Sorry about that, I thought you
Tell some jokes.
Okay, so I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the Family and Medical Leave Insurance Act. Is anybody, just show of hands, how many of you are familiar with it at all? Okay. So this is something that was passed by the voters in 2020. And it's a Colorado program, although it is effective in, I think, 9 or 10 states now. And bottom line, it's a way to provide income to people, resident or employees of Colorado if they're out of work for a major medical issue. A lot of times it's the same things as that you might take FMLA for, but when you have FMLA, you don't receive pay. So the voters passed it in 2020. The premiums begin being collected in January of 2023. And it's a state administered program, so they collect the fees for, it's basically like a tax. They collect that for a year, and then people can start applying for benefits in 2024. It's eligible. It's a program for Colorado employees who have an eligible, approved medical incident, major medical, serious illness, new child, adopted child. And you can receive up to 12 weeks of pay while you're on this leave. You are eligible to be able to make claims once you've earned $2,500 in Colorado within 1 year, 12 months. Independent contractors and elected officials are not considered employees, although there are options for anybody, that's what we're going to get into here in a minute, that's not a employee of a company. I'm trying to see what's. So basically, every Colorado employee has to participate in this program with the exception of local government employees and self-employed individuals. So being a local government, that's why we're here tonight. Local governments basically have three options within this program. The first one is to participate in the family program like other employers. So an employer with 10 employers or more, their premiums per employee are basically 0.9% of the employee's wage. Half of it is paid by the employee and half is paid by the employer if you have 10 or more employees. If you have less than 10, then the employer doesn't have to pay anything, so you only remit the 0.45 for that the employee pays. So if you participate in the program, every employee would pay that. The town would collect the money from every employee. We would send in, we would do all the paperwork, we would do the reporting, and we would remit the funds quarterly. The second option is to decline employer participation, which means an employee could still opt to participate through the town, and the town, because we have more than 10 employees, would not pay the 0.45, but an employee could say, I want to do that, and we would be responsible for collecting the money and remitting it on behalf of the employee. And the third option is to decline all participation, which means as a town, we don't pay into the program, nor do we collect the money from the employees. And actually the second one, so that we don't collect the money from the employees. But each employee has the option to do it on their own. So they would go into the Colorado unemployment or the family website, set up an account, remit their payments, and then they would be eligible to file a claim in 2024 if they qualify. So our request is that we decline all participation. And the reason is because by declining all participation, every employee still has the right to participate on their own, but we're not forcing all employees to participate in case somebody chooses not to. It's the exact same cost for the employee, whether they do it on their own or whether we collect the money and send it in for them. It takes away the liability from the town and the administration collecting the fees through payroll and saving them for the quarter and then sending in reporting, and then we're not liable for making sure that these payments are sent in correctly. Each employee is responsible for their own, just like any other bill that they may have. They would do a report online, send in the payments quarterly. Each individual is responsible for their own choice to participate or not participate. If an employee chooses to participate, they are required to participate for 3 years, which is the exact same thing that would be in our case. Employees can opt in at any time as long as they've earned $2,500 within a year. And it's the exact same premium of 0.45% that would be paid if it was collected through the town. And currently, this is a list of local governments that have either already have or will be opting out. Wasn't enough room to put all of the ones that were on the list, nor did we have information from every town. One town is opting in to do where they collect it on behalf of the employee and send it in for them, and that's Windsor. And 2 local governments have chosen to opt in completely. So if you have any questions, I can try to answer your questions. Otherwise, that's the presentation.
Okay. Trustee Murphy? Just to be clear, if the city does decide to go forward and sign up for the program, is it possible for employees to opt out at all or no? Thank you.
If we sign up, every employee pays. They don't have a choice.
Gotcha.
And just by way of mention, we did notify all the employees about the meeting tonight with their opportunity to provide their own testimony if they wanted to speak in favor or against, both in their pay stubs and via email, so.
Anybody else have any questions regarding family leave? I actually have one. If we could go back a couple of slides, you had the good, better, best kind of 3-way breakout. What would be the downside of choosing, say, the middle option of decline employer participation? So the town would essentially decline that, but the employee would still be doing that. We would have to collect that from their paycheck. But is there a downside for the town using the middle option?
The biggest downside is there's no reason for the town to have that liability. So what we would have to do is if we decided to go with the middle option, I'm saying we could do it, but we would set up a pay code in the payroll system. The payroll staff would be responsible for making sure that everybody's aware they could come and sign up. We would have forms for them to sign up. We're responsible for collecting the money. We're responsible for sending it in, reporting it, and when you report it, you have to list everybody, their wages, calculation. And if there's, not that we would do anything wrong, but we're taking on that administrative liability on behalf of the employee that we don't need to do. There's a lot of reporting that we do that we have to do. We do the unemployment reporting and the W-2s and the federal taxes, and we do all of that. This is something that we don't need to do. So the only downside is that the town is taking on a liability that we don't need to take on.
Okay. Makes sense. Okay. Anybody else? Questions?
If a employee decides to add more than the 0.45, no?
It wouldn't matter. The 0.45 is what you would pay. That's the percentage. That it doesn't mean that if you file a claim, you're gonna get more money.
Mhm.
And it doesn't go into a person's account. It's like unemployment, where we pay in a portion of everybody's wage to unemployment. If you file unemployment, they're not gonna say, well, you've only paid $300, so that's all you get. The calculation of what you would get if you filed a claim is based on your income, not on what you've paid in. So number one, there's no reason to pay in more. But I don't even know that they would allow you to because it's a calculation based on your income.
So then maybe I'm not understanding then to participate, it would be the employee pays into the pot and then the employer would pay back the employee and then pay the employee's part of the pot? Where's the 0.9% coming from, I guess?
So the 0.9, if you have more than 10 or more employees, the employee, we collect 0.45 from the employee, and then the employer also pays 0.45 on behalf of the employee.
And
So
that's
we
just
send in,
It's like an insurance premium,
yeah.
right? So
Then, well, now I'm confused as to why the employee can't choose to provide more than the 0.45 if they so choose, because what is the reasoning, and might be a terrible question. But what is the reasoning for forcing, if you opt in, to have the employee pay 0.45 and the employer pay 0.45 for a 0.9 if that's not going to in any way benefit the person who's paying the extra 0.45?
So basically the state wants 0.9 for all the employees. But what they're saying is if you only have 9 employees, you're a small business, we're not gonna make you pay a 0.9. They're trying to collect money from the bigger employers. So it's the state trying to collect money, not the employee trying to pay more money. So
So it's a
the
tax for
0.9,
having more
it's-
than 10 employees?
Yeah, it's basically you're starting at 0.9, you're taking 0.45 and 0.45. That's kind of your starting point. But if you have less than 10 employees, we're not gonna make the employer pay 0.45.
Okay.
So rather than saying, if you have 10 now, you have to pay 0.45, it's kind of like you get a break if you only have 9 employees or less.
Thank you.
Any other questions? No? Okay, I guess at this point, open it up to any kind of public comment, as this is a public
Public testimony?
testimony. Is there anybody in the public that would like to speak to this, one way or another? No, seeing none. I take it nobody signed up online to speak to it? No? Okay, as discussed at the beginning of the meeting, in order to keep things all green across the board, we will leave the public input section open and then move on to item number 4 to be brought back up on the meeting on the 22nd.
Correct.
So no decisions are being made, no votes are being made. We're just gonna pick this back up on the 22nd so that there's been enough notice. All right, on to number 4, which is the oil and gas regulations, presented by Attorney Mike Foote here, and sorry, I forgot your name. Apologies. Thank you. So thank you, sir.
Very good. Well, good evening, Mayor Pro Tem and members of the board. Thank you very much for calling this up on the agenda. I understand that we're the last item before you get to your budget discussion, so that might be a bit of a precarious position for us to be in, but we'll try to make it through anyway. As you mentioned, Ms. Trask is here from the COGCC. She's the permitting manager at the COGCC, and that was a result of your request at the last meeting you wanted to hear from somebody from the COGCC about their permitting practices and any questions you have along those lines. And so I'm very pleased that she is willing to be here and answer those questions. And I think she might have a 2 or 3 kind of off the cuff just introduction to what it is that they do and their procedures, and then maybe just open it for questions from there. And I think I'll probably just maybe operate along the same lines. It'll really be driven by what you all want to do. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation. You should have received the November 1st memo that I put out, which was a follow-up on some of the questions that you had, as well as giving a little bit more additional information. That memo had 4 sections, but really 3 main sections. The first was a follow-up on a question that you had about some of the various local jurisdictions around here and when they had done their last amendments of their local oil and gas rules. And I think what you see from the table is it's a bit of a grab bag. But most of them have not done any kind of revision since 2019, although Fort Collins is in the midst of doing a revision right now. And they have a first reading of a new ordinance that's set for December the 6th, I believe. But there are some that just haven't touched it, and then there's a few that have actually done some revisions since then. The second main section was, I think, an effort to give you maybe a good sense of the outer and inner realms, if you will, of what some of the local jurisdictions have done that we've used as comparison jurisdictions. You know, what's kind of on the outside of the most restrictive type of regulation for the different areas that we're looking at now with locations in particular, either setbacks or reciprocal setbacks. And then also what would be maybe considered the least restrictive type of regulation from those comparison jurisdictions. And so hopefully that will help guide you as to what some of the other comparison jurisdictions have done, or at least not necessarily having a huge table of 25 different regulations and trying to compare them all, but just giving you an idea of, okay, this has been the most restrictive, this has been the least restrictive in these areas, and then you can take a look and decide, well, maybe Berthoud would be good to be here or in the middle or there, or whatever the case may be. And then the third main section, I just decided to start sketching out what an ordinance could look like, or an ordinance revision could look like, because some people just like to see it on paper and see kind of how it's gonna come out. Of course, it's not comprehensive, there will be additional language that's put into it, but also I wanted to highlight some of the decision point areas in this draft of the ordinance that you all would probably need to make in order to make the draft go where it should when talking about implementing these new regulations. Now, you may have noticed that throughout the several presentations that I've given so far and during the Q&A sections, I've tried to take more of a hands-off approach, basically just putting the information out there and just throwing it back into your court. And of course, I'm happy to do that. You all are the policymakers. If it would help in the future, I could suggest some ways to go to and maybe use that as a starting point if you think that would help. Really, I'm at your disposal, and in the way that you think I would be most helpful, I'm happy to accommodate. So perhaps that can be something we can think about too and try to decide the best way to go about it in the future. So from there, I suppose I can open it up for any questions you might have for me, or if you want to hear from Ms. Trask and have questions for her first, that's fine as well. But of course, it's really just up to you how you want to proceed.
Okay. I think there's no major preference up here. I guess it's all right, we can start, I guess, asking Ms. Trask.
Of course.
Any questions regarding the COGCC and
If I may, as Ms. Trask is coming up, as you all know, I sent out an email and mentioned at last meeting that we could gather up questions, they could respond in writing as well. We did receive 5 questions. And in general, the COGCC couldn't answer them because they were either related to local issues like reverse setbacks that they don't regulate, or that are more appropriate maybe for the operators, the operator associations. And then the last question, and I'll pass this out, we'll have a copy available if anybody's interested. Related to how far away wellheads, from wellheads to seepage occur. Not a specific answer there, but there is online information about where you can look at spill and remediation data, so. Anyway, for that, I'll just pass those down for you guys to have.
Sure.
Sorry.
No, thank you for having me. I am happy to answer any questions that you might have. Sorry, I'm Sabrina Trask. I'm the Planning and Permitting Manager at the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. I've been with the commission for 6 years, as manager for the last 1 year. So you're probably familiar with Senate Bill 19-181, changed our mission from fostering oil and gas development to regulating, and specifically regulating oil and gas development in a manner that is protective of public health, safety, welfare, the environment, and wildlife resources. So we did our mission change rulemaking. We basically rewrote the entire suite of rules. And those new rules went into effect on January 15th of 2021. So almost 2 years ago now that we've been implementing those rules. So again, I don't have a presentation or anything, but I'm happy to engage in whatever discussion I can.
Sure. Anybody have any questions for the COGCC now that they're here?
I would just like to know what the process is for going to the sites and just reviewing the safety concerns and how that goes through different processes and that the accountability with keeping to a certain standards. Because I think my biggest concern with the policy is how are these things enforced and regulated? And I just would love to know from the state level how stringent that process is and what that looks like, just so that we have a frame of reference on how that rolls out.
Sure, yeah. Thank you for the question. It's kind of a 2-part process. So the first part of our sort of setting us up for potential enforcement is the permitting process. As operators apply for applications, those applications are vetted by our technical staff. every oil and gas development plan application, OGDP application, goes before the commission to be voted on. So the commission decides. It used to be under the old rules, the director would decide whether or not to approve or deny a permit. Now it goes, every application goes before the commission. There's a robust local government input process, a robust public comment process. If an OGDP is approved, then the operator is required to comply with all of the best management practices that were approved in their application, approved in their permit. So that's kind of setting up the framework, the guardrails for this is what is approved, this many acres at this location, this many wells, this many tanks, this type of equipment. Part two then is we have our compliance team, and so we have a pretty big group of folks who are our field inspectors. They go out regularly. There's sort of the oil and gas type of field inspectors, and then there's also reclamation inspectors. So when an operator wants to start construction, they want to start building the pad, our reclamation inspectors go out. We receive notice from the operator. Our reclamation inspectors go out. They're watching the construction of the pad. They're watching stormwater, BMPs, best management practices, compliance even with, the construction of berms and maintaining protections to keep water either on the location or to move water off the location from heavy rains, that sort of thing. So we have people observing the location being built. We have people inspecting during drilling, during completions operations, during flowback operations, and then once the wells are put into production, which is kind of when all the surface activity kind of stops at that point. We still have inspectors that inspect regularly. They are looking for wellbore integrity at the wellhead, equipment integrity, emissions, flaring, as well as maintaining the stormwater BMPs and the surface protections as well. So if a field inspector were to go out and see something that doesn't align with a COGCC rule or something that doesn't align with the approved permit, then they would reach out to the operator, find out, what's going on, and kind of like the officer over there kind of talk to the operator, find out what's going on. We generally try to get operators to comply rather than us jumping directly to enforcement. Stuff happens in the real world, and so that we need to try to give them a little bit of an opportunity to respond. That said, if there's anything that's sort of, flagrant non-compliance, then that could go directly to a notice of alleged violation, NOAV, which would then go to our enforcement unit, and then the AG's office might get involved. So it escalates, it can escalate from there.
What's the frequency once the well's established of visits and inspections?
It depends. It depends statewide. So I think in the DJ Basin, so the general area here, it really does depend on the operations. It depends on the operator. We have a public complaint portal on our website. So if we receive a public complaint for what we consider a nuisance impact, so noise, odors, lights, dust, truck traffic, that sort of thing, we will have our field inspector go out immediately or, within a few hours. If we get a complaint lodged at 3:00 in the morning, we might not send someone out till 6 or 7 in the morning. Unless there's an emergency, then they go out immediately. So there's different requirements in our rules that operators must meet. So for an example, wellbore integrity, there's different, and I'm not an engineer, so I don't want to misspeak here, but there are different requirements to demonstrate the integrity of the wellbore itself. There's Braden-Head tests and there's mechanical integrity tests. Those generally are on a yearly basis or a 5-year basis, just depending on what the test is and the status of the well. If the well is shut in, if the well is temporarily abandoned, if the well is producing. So we do have a pretty robust inspection process.
And do you feel like you've had positive response with the new standards that have been put in place? Has the feedback from citizens gone down or up? I'm just curious how the enforcement side in the last couple of years, how that's impacted you guys. Just trying to understand the culture around it right now.
That's a really good question. I feel that public participation has skyrocketed, and I think that actually is a benefit. With our new mission change rules, our process has been made so transparent. We are seeking public input. We're making our process is more available across a broader spectrum of people. We've incorporated disproportionately impacted communities into our permitting process, so there's more. We are requiring more outreach by the operators to reach traditionally underserved communities or underrepresented communities. And so because of our desire to engage the public, we have had a lot more public input in our permitting process. The enforcement process is a little bit different because that's not as open to public input. Once something has been referred to our enforcement team, it's basically sort of becomes the operator's attorney versus the state's attorneys, kind of hashing out what are any penalties that need to be assessed, what are any corrective actions that need to be undertaken. And so that is a little more removed from public input.
And just one more question, I don't mean to bogart
No,
it,
go
I'm
for it.
sorry. I'm just curious about enforcement. If a community or a municipality puts in more stringent laws in place, how does that impact your guys' job, and how do you work together with the city, or do you work together, or is it on the town to enforce if they have more stringent protocols? I'm just curious what that looks like.
Yeah, that's an excellent question as well. And so I don't want to misquote. I'm also, not only am I not an engineer, I'm not an attorney, so I don't want to misquote Senate Bill 19-181, but I do believe that the statute describes that if there's a municipality or a county that has stricter rules than what the state has, the operator must apply with those more strict rules. In the case where the municipality's rules are stricter than the state's, in either case, the state cannot enforce upon a local jurisdiction's codes or ordinance. So if you were to have a set of rules and we have our set of rules, we can only pursue enforcement actions under our rules. So this plays an important part, particularly with things like access roads. We don't permit access roads. We feel that that's a local jurisdictional land use authority. And so, if complaints can come in, we will refer the complaint to the local government because you have the expertise on which roads are the best roads for truck traffic and that sort of thing. So we can only enforce state rules. We cannot enforce local government rules. We do, however, really try to be collaborative, cooperative, engaged in the local permitting process. And I don't know if I should do this, I'm just gonna use Weld County as the example. We know that they have their WOGLA permitting process, the Weld Oil and Gas Location Assessment Process. And they've undergone some changes over the last few years. The WOGLA permitting process kind of goes hand in hand with the COGCC's permitting process. And so there's a lot of opportunities for the local government to provide feedback on permits submitted to the state. And the state is also given opportunities to provide feedback on the WOGLA, the local government permit applications that are being sought. And so there's a lot of alignment with those two processes, and we encourage that. I think it serves the communities better, it serves people that are living in and around oil and gas better, it serves the municipalities better, it serves the state better, it serves realistically, it serves industry better if those processes do have some tangible alignments that bring some consistency, some predictability to both permitting processes. We frequently interact with local governments during our process, during their process, and we appreciate that opportunity. Trying to find a win-win.
Thank you. That's very insightful.
Yeah, you're welcome.
First years.
How often would you say non-compliance happens with your inspectors?
I don't know. I'm not in that unit. We do have on the COGCC's webpage, there is it's called the DAD, the Daily Activity Dashboard. I think it's updated every night, sometime in the middle of the night, so every day there should be refreshed data on it. And I think one of the pages in that dashboard indicates spills, which certainly a spill is, it's generally an accident, but it's still out of compliance. I don't know though how to answer that question. I'm just not familiar with all of the ins and outs of our enforcement process.
Same question for enforcement, but same answer, okay. Do you know why the 2,000 foot setback is kind of standard?
Not as well as I probably should. I was not the manager during the rulemaking process. I was in the oil and gas location assessment team, which does all the surface permitting, but I was not actually directly involved with that part of the rulemaking, so I didn't follow it. I don't want to speculate. I do know that prior to when Senate Bill 19-181 first came out in 2019, there was sort of an interim set of rules that were a Band-Aid, if you will, until we could do our rulemaking and implement the new emission change rules. Part of that Band-Aid involved something that was called the director's, it's just slipped my mind. It'll come to me probably as I'm driving back to Westminster tonight. But there was a list of criteria that for every proposed oil and gas location, the director, and so the Oil and Gas Location Assessment or OGLA staff would review. For every proposed location, we would look through this list of criteria to look for potential receptors to impacts if this proposed location would be approved. One of those criteria was sort of marking out a 1,500 foot buffer from the proposed pad and looking at how many residential building units or houses are within that 1,500 foot buffer. So I think then that during the rulemaking, excuse me, that 1,500 foot buffer that we were looking at the director's objective criteria got extended out to 2,000 feet, but I'm sorry, I don't know why 2,000 feet is sort of became the limit.
Okay, but it did start out at 1,500.
It started out sort of informally under the director's objective criteria as that Band-Aid rule between the approval of Senate Bill 19-181 and until we actually did the rulemaking. So a period of about a year and a half, we were using 1,500 feet.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I don't mind jumping in. Just regarding the class 2 water disposal wells, and do I have this correct? Typically, they are on the same site as the wellhead, correct?
So a class 2 UIC, underground injection control, is a well that is meant to receive produced water for injection for long-term, basically disposal. I could do some research and get back to you, but there are a number of those locations that the only well on the pad is a UIC well. And there are certain locations where there's, a number of producing oil and gas wells and a UIC well on the same pad. I don't know off the top of my head how many, like what is sort
Just
of the
dependent
ratio.
on the geology of the location, correct?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. For those locations that wouldn't be adjacent, say you're taking it to a different location, what kind of truck traffic does that generate?
That's a good question. I don't know. We haven't permitted. I think we may have only permitted one UIC well under the new rules so far, and it was associated, I believe, with active oil and gas wells on the same location. So that's a good question. I don't know that I can answer.
And then just going into the state level of regulation on those, how is that handled at this point?
We have, I brought the rule book if you wanna look at it. We have, the 800 series in our rules discusses, basically all the UIC wells. So if you wanna go review that, I'm not super familiar with those, but to permit a new UIC well would require an oil and gas development plan application. That's the standard OGDP application. It would have to go before the commission for a decision. It would have to include public comment. So part of our a standard OGDP application is gonna include the Form 2A, which is a form that existed under the old rules. That's the surface oil and gas location assessment, so the surface assessment of the pad. A UIC well will have that Form 2A to look at surface concerns. It will have the standard Form 2, which is the actual well permit to drill the well. So the Form 2A approves construction of the pad. The Form 2 approves drilling a well. For UIC wells, there's also a Form 31 and a Form 33, which are two additional permit applications that are required for any UIC well. So it's the same process as a regular oil and gas well, plus more.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And I guess the last question, kind of unrelated, do you have like a typical size of like a working pad? Like what's kind of the general square footage?
For the DJ basin
Yeah.
or statewide, there's a lot of variability. In this part of the world, this part of the state, it's more common that we see multi-well pads. So one pad that will have any number of wells on it. So say, a 10 well pad. We have a few pads permitted under the old rules that have significantly more than 10 wells. And we still have the occasional 1 or 2 well pad. I would say, and I'm kind of just spitballing here.
Sure.
For a 10 well pad in the DJ basin, you might be looking at 10 acres for disturbance, for maximum disturbance. During construction and drilling and completing the well, there's a lot of heavy equipment that needs to come in, and they need space for rigs, space for completions, frac crews, frac tanks, that sort of thing. And then once the wells are drilled and completed, a lot of that stuff gets moved out, and there's a phase called interim reclamation. And so that's where, once the wells are in production, and all the heavy equipment goes away, then that well pad gets smalled down. So because if it's just wellheads, if there's pipeline takeaway for gas, for oil, and even for produced water, there's really very little infrastructure left at the surface on the site. So you could get a well pad reclaimed down for interim reclamation that might be 2 or 3 acres. So it's a pretty significant difference. The caveat is that if there is not produced water pipeline takeaway, and if there is not oil pipeline takeaway, then there's gonna be tanks remaining on the pad long-term to hold the produced water and hold the oil. That will keep the interim reclamation size of the pad still fairly large. And then there will be increased truck trips to pull the produced water and the oil off the location.
I really appreciate that. That kind of covers all my questions.
Anything from you? I had I guess, two. I know when fracking occurs, a lot of the fluid they use, sometimes they claim is proprietary. Is there any intention by the COGCC to essentially say, no, you can't say it's proprietary, you need to tell us what goes down there, and if not, what's that looking like?
So there's a website called Frac Focus. I don't know if you're familiar with that. We have in our rules the requirement that operators for every well that is drilled, they have to report to Frac Focus, which is it's a third party. It's not run by COGCC. It's a nationwide third party entity. And so our rules do require all operators to report what fluids they use for hydraulic fracturing, that they report that to Frac Focus. And so it's a nationwide database, and if you have the well's API number, which is like the fingerprint of the well, it's the designation of the well, you can search that database for any well in the country to find out what was used to frack. We also have a Form 5 is a report that the operators have to submit after they drill the well that describes what they drilled. And so we do require them to provide some information about drilling fluids and that sort of thing. And then we have a Form 5A, which is a required report for them to submit after they complete the well. The Form 5A for every well then also does have some information, but not at the granular and detailed level of the Frac Focus.
Okay. Do you know if Frac Focus allows people or certain operators to claim proprietary or?
I think they do,
Okay.
which is problematic, and I know that in the past, during rulemaking and since rulemaking, there's still been some discussion internally with us and with the AG's office about what that looks like. So I don't know if that is going to change in our rules. We have no control over Frac Focus.
Sure. No, it's good information to have there. The other question I have, and I guess this was more just a specific question that I don't know if I actually got the answer to. When a well's being drilled, is the distance measured from where the actual penetration in for the well basin starts, or is that kind of the edge of where they have those sound barriers? Just, 2,000 feet from where it's being drilled, or 2,000 feet from, their big sound walls? I guess I was, I don't think anybody gave me a clear answer on that. I apologize if you did.
So kind of both.
Oh, okay.
And I need to be very careful about this.
Sure.
Our rules measure the distance to, say, a house as measured from the working pad surface, which is, it's a defined term in our 100 series. That's basically the edge of the well pad. It doesn't include, stormwater berms or like a stormwater retention pond. It really is the working pad surface is the part of the pad where the work is done. It's usually gravelled over, compacted, it's where the trucks drive on, that sort of thing. So our rules, in our rules, we measure to, and we have operators measure from the edge of the working pad surface to the nearest receptor, whether that's a house, a school, a stream, a wetland. There are also within our rules times when we want a specific measurement from a wellhead. So for permitting purposes on the Form 2A, we look at what is the distance from the working pad surface. The 2,000 feet is measured from the working pad surface, not from the wellhead itself.
Okay.
So it actually, so if you have your working pad surface is here and you measure a line from here to the nearest house is 2,000 feet and the well is over here, then the distance from the house to the well might be 2,200 feet. So the working pad surface kind of gives a little bit of extra buffer.
Yeah, no, that's good to know. I wasn't 100% as to where that measurement started and stopped, so. But yeah, those are the gists of my questions. Anybody else? Trustee Butler?
Not really sure who this is best directed at, but regarding administration, you mentioned, earlier that if the local municipality has higher, restrictions or guidelines, that you guys don't really, inspect or enforce. So how would that be administered from, if we have more strict guidelines?
Well, we would have to be the ones to do that enforcement. We either have to do that with existing staff or identify consultants or contractors that could perform the work, depending on what it was we were looking at. One of the things we've talked about in the past is dealing with land use issues is generally pretty easy for us, because we do that every day. Getting into air quality monitoring, water quality monitoring, things like that, those have come up in the past as, concerns and maybe the town should have stricter regulations on. We're not currently equipped to handle any of those items. So, does that answer your question,
It
Trustee?
does. Yes.
And I might just add sort of on the heels of that, we would still enforce if our rules were not, if someone was in violation of our rules. So if you had a local process that was more rigorous than ours, and an operator was in violation of our rules, they'd probably be in violation of yours as well if your rules were even stricter. So we would pursue enforcement on our rules, which might sort of have a ripple effect or, some benefit to you as the local government. But but we wouldn't enforce, if an operator was in compliance with our rules to this level and your rule was up here and this is where they were lacking compliance, there would be nothing that we would be able to do to support you.
Right, you don't have the oversight or.
We don't have the oversight or the authority, that's,
authority.
yeah, and we wouldn't overstep our bounds
So what
of
if our,
jurisdiction.
I guess, the reverse scenario, what if our rules were more lax in COGCC?
We can't adopt rules that are, we can't approve, like we couldn't, if the limit at the state level under the COGCC's rulemaking process was 2,000 foot setbacks, we can't waive that away. Like we can't reduce
We're
the
subject to a
state
minimum.
rules. We would see theirs as kind of the minimum, and then we could, in areas where we have the authority to implement stricter regulations.
Okay, perfect, thank you.
So I might clarify something and tell me to stop if I'm telling you something you already know. There's a lot of focus on the 2,000 foot setback. In our 600 series, it's the 600 series, so 601, 604 in particular. There are what sort of are termed off-ramps for operators where they can seek an application for a location that is closer than 2,000 feet to a house. They have to demonstrate additional protections. So for example, 604B1, I believe, is informed consent. So say there's a house at 1,500 feet away from the working pad surface. And it is the surface owner of the property, and the surface owner wants this pad on their property, and they've signed a surface use agreement, and they have their own minerals that they've leased to the operator, so they're in it, for an income. They could sign, we have a template, the operator could provide to them a whole big packet of required information, review it with that homeowner, and the homeowner would have the ability, if they chose, to sign informed consent, saying, yes, I understand this is the proposal, I understand there may be impacts such as noise and dust and light and odor, and I sign my informed consent agreeing to the placement of this pad. So that's one off-ramp that gives particularly surface owners a way to work in cooperation with operators if they want to have a location closer in than 2,000 feet. Another off-ramp site, and it's 604B2, is for a location proposed closer than 2,000 feet, but that has been approved through a comprehensive area plan, a CAP. And I don't know if you wanna go down the CAP rabbit hole. A CAP effectively is a very large landscape level permit application that might be approved for thousands and thousands of acres and multiple locations. And CAPs, we just actually, the commission just heard a CAP application last week or the week before, last week, I guess. So that's if an operator has an approved CAP application, then they could submit an OGDP application for a certain so the CAP say approved 20 locations in 30,000 acres. Then the operator would submit an OGDP location and say, this is one of the CAP locations that I want to permit. Now, they still have to go through the OGDP process, but if this location was sort of conceptually approved in the CAP hearing, then they could apply under 604B2 and say, we're gonna be 1,900 feet away from a house and we have this sort of preliminary CAP approval. So that's another off-ramp. It's not an easy one because a CAP is a really big application. We've only had 2 so far. We have the third CAP will be heard December 7th. So in 2 years of the new rules, there's only been 2 approved and 1 more coming up for hearing. 604B3 is another off-ramp that if the working pad surface is within 2,000 feet of a house, but so say it's 1,900 feet from a house, but all the wells are way over on this side and the house is way over there, the distance from the wells to the house is greater than 2,000 feet. That's still another opportunity, that's another off-ramp for the operators, even though the working pad surface is, say, 1,900 or 1,800 feet. So there's a few different case-by-case scenarios that are allowed within our rules that operators can seek. They are typically more difficult to get approval, but the commission has all but 1 have been approved using those off-ramps.
Okay, yeah, that helps. Thank you.
Just you said,
Never mind.
no, never mind.
I do have one more.
Sure.
Can you just update us on what the current or how the standard has changed with the air quality monitoring and what that entails?
No.
Okay.
I will defer to
Put a pin in that one.
CDPHE on that. APCD, the Air Pollution Control Division, they do all of the air monitoring, the air permitting related to oil and gas. We generally we support them in their effort to do that, but that is completely outside of our jurisdiction.
Okay, that's totally fair.
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else? No? Okay. Thank you. If we have any
course.
other questions, I'm sure we can.
My pleasure.
Thank
Thanks.
you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I believe this is also some intent for direction as to where we need to start moving next or where the board is interested in now that we've got a little bit of feedback from the CGCC is what you're looking for?
Well, if you're comfortable doing that at this point, that's of course your prerogative. One thing I wanted to pick up on the 2,000 foot setback, because there was a number of questions on that, is that if you recall, there was some information in one of my first memos about the 2,000 foot setback and some of the history there, as well as where some of the local governments have come in. And so you can always review that if you want some more information about the 2,000 foot setback. That's where many of the local governments have settled, although with either less or different types of exceptions than Ms. Trask outlined for COGCC. Or as you were mentioning, the measurement distances. So instead of measuring to the house, for example, it would measure to the property line of the house or the property line of the school.
Right.
And so there's been some fiddling around the edges around the 2,000 foot setback. If you want it to be more restrictive, then you can, of course, change where the measurements occur from, or reduce the number of the off-ramps, or eliminate the off-ramps entirely. Some local governments have decided that they want to not only impose a 2,000 foot setback, but also have restrictions based on zoning. which the COGCC doesn't deal with because they're a state agency, not a local agency. So they'll say it can only be in an industrial zoned area plus a 2,000-foot setback. And so we've seen that with some various local governments, and Fort Collins is going in that direction with their regulations as well. So I guess I'm not sure if you all had any other questions that you thought that you wanted to bounce off of me as well. Or if you wanted to talk about general direction, and then I could come back with maybe a more specific draft for the next time. I guess obviously I'm just looking to see what you all are comfortable with at this point.
Sure. Speaking for it, I think we need to start getting some kind of draft in place. We've had a lot of good information across the board so far. And I'm not saying we need to have this thing finished by the end of the year, obviously. But we have all of this information laid out of, here's the most strict, here's the least strict. We can kind of figure out where we fit in the middle of that, but I think we need to start kind of moving in that direction personally. I don't know if the rest of the board agrees with that, but I think that we could start pushing in that direction. Not everything tonight, but a couple of we would like to see this. This is a little bit less important. I mean, we could do that a la carte right now, or I'm not sure what everybody else is comfortable with doing.
Maybe, and that, you guys are certainly welcome to do that, and we wouldn't discourage you from doing that. One of the things that may be helpful, and you hear me ask this question all the time, so hopefully this isn't new, but I think if we could define which problems it is that we want to try and solve. What are the areas of focus, right? I mean, as I think we're all learning, I hope it's not just me, but this is such a huge policy topic, right? It's a very complicated industry that operates in ways that we know very little about. And again, I think what we're good at is land use, zoning, land use, surface use impacts, right? That's kind of our purview anyway. And within the context of the information that Mr. Foots provided, maybe some of the answers that you've heard tonight from Ms. Trask, or any of the other information that we've kind of uncovered throughout the course of this process, perhaps it would be maybe most efficient to say, if you wanted to all send us an email and say, here's the things I think we need to address. And based on the information provided, kind of here's where I feel most comfortable. And if we could gather all that up and bring it back, that'll all be public and part of the process, right? Put all that in a memo, and then we can say, based on all the feedback we've gotten, here's the recommendation we think we can provide in terms of what that policy or regulatory framework might look like. And looking at it from that lens of, we're not starting oil and gas regulation from scratch, right? And we don't need to, and we don't want to. But saying, here are the things that we're most concerned about. If that's, hey, I really don't care about, how far a well is set back from, a sports field, but it really matters to me about a house. Or, hey, I think sports fields, houses, any other residential structure that might, or, commercial structure that might get some certificate of occupancy. I'm using something right out of the memo, right? But, there's kind of in that most restrictive or least restrictive, I think as you kind of review that, you'll say, these are the things that I think we really need to address. And as we start to put together that regulation, we can say, here's the issues that have been identified, here's the concerns the board has, and here's how we can address those in the regulation.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think.
We definitely need to
Is that a
address
reasonable,
we definitely need to address the issues that the COGC doesn't address because that's left up to us. So we should definitely focus on those areas, make sure that those are our needs.
Sure.
Like Chris said, we do land use and surface rights pretty well.
Mhm.
So plug those holes and then
Keep moving forward with.
and then move forward with the things that are important to us that the COGC already has on their books and just compare them and see if we're on target or high or too high.
Does that work with everybody else where you essentially send an email off and the public can send emails off as well with concerns? And we can come back, filter through with it and say, this is kind of the consensus and we can work from there, but everybody be okay sending that over, it'll be a part of the memo. We'd be doing that on our own, not here in a meeting right now, because these can get a little bit long-winded at times. Is that agreeable, yeah.
Yeah, just to add on to that, I really appreciate having the rough draft language with like
Oh, yeah.
possible, changes or the, actual location definitions included in there. So I mean, for time and efficiency, I feel like if we were able to kind of get together our answers for these.
Yeah.
And send them off to you and come back with kind of a holistic idea of what this first round looks like. I think that's probably the most efficient way we
Yeah.
can do this.
I think that would work out.
So one way to be to just
That's
copy
acceptable.
his 3-column chart in here and make a 4th column for our own comments.
Well, and maybe even more than that, Mr. Foote did put together, like, here's a draft of some language. And as you go through that and you compare that to kind of that most restrictive, least restrictive, and some of the other information from this memo and previous memos, I think it'll be easy for you, maybe individually, to say, here's where I think we should land. And we can gather all that up and distill that down into something that then we can come back with all those yellow blanks filled in and say, here's where we think we're at based on the feedback we received. Here's the feedback we received, so everybody knows what that looks like.
Sure.
And go from there.
Would that work for you?
That's great, of course, yeah, that's fine, and happy to come up with another draft based on the feedback. One thing that I should have mentioned maybe a little bit before, this is a little out of order, but there were a number of questions that came up about enforcement. Trustee Butler, Trustee Sorcelli came up with those questions, and this is part of the reason why I wanted to put the location stuff first. Because location stuff is stuff that you're familiar with, has been said with land use. And then we can get into the more hairier questions about enforcement and public health, safety and welfare regulations, but it seemed to me like it would be important to kind of put the baseline down of, okay, where's this facility gonna be? First of all, any new facilities that come in, where are they gonna be? Then after that decision has been mostly made, then, okay, what kind of regulations are we gonna put on those facilities? And so I think what you're proposing is something that I could definitely work with, and hopefully we can get something back to you about location, and then once you settled on that, then we can start getting into public health, safety and welfare regulations, as well as enforcement and some of those questions that you brought up.
Okay. So how long would you need for us to send, essentially, how much time do you need for us to have this by? Say a week, 2 weeks, when would you need to have this so we could continue this conversation, I guess, whatever that would work for staff?
We've been doing I think maybe about a 4 to 6 week, more like a 6 week interim in between meetings, I think. 6 weeks from now would be that Tuesday before Christmas. I'm not sure if you're gonna meet then or not, but
That's on my list to talk to you about tonight, but we have not historically met.
Week of Christmas, okay.
right, so the week before that, or the 2 weeks before that, I'm just thinking through my other commitments. I'm not sure if I'd be able to, I might be able to get something to you by then, but if you all have something within the next week or so, then I think we can work with that and figure out what the next best date would be.
Okay.
So we can just say kind of before Thanksgiving, if we can gather up all that
Right.
information, then give us, and then we'll probably look to bring it back to you at the first meeting in January, maybe.
Would you like us to send this to you or both of you, or how do you guys want us to
I
handle
think either way is fine, if you have, certainly I'd like to be copied and the three of us, Attorney Smith, Attorney Foote, and myself. If you wanna just send it to me, that's fine, I'll make sure it gets to the right place too.
So to clarify, we're looking for the whys of what issues we're trying to resolve.
I think if there are some that are not addressed in that language that Mr. Foote has put together that's in the packet, there's some items in there that you say, hey, I think there's a problem here that we haven't addressed as it relates to location, then let us know that. Otherwise, I think just kind of saying, here's where I think we should fall on these blanks that are included, that are all highlighted in yellow in your packet, that would be really helpful.
And I just wanna clarify on the zoning restrictions, how are those implemented before? Were we making sure that the operations were happening in certain zone districts, or have we ever encountered that before?
There's only a handful of wells in town and they're all out on the east end of town, as you know, we've talked about it before. And they were all within zoning districts that would allow for that. Or they were approved before that regulation was in place, so.
Thank you.
Okay. So everybody's okay having some form of insight sent off by Thanksgiving to town staff and Attorney Foot. Okay. I guess no other questions or comments or anything like that, we can go on. How's everybody feeling? You wanna keep going onto a budget meeting? Everybody need a break? No?
I wouldn't mind.
A break? Alright,
Public comment?
oh, do we need public comment? Is
Up
it,
to you. I mean, you're not making a decision tonight, but I don't think it would be a bad thing to.
yeah, sure, is there any, anybody, please, come on up, yeah. Just need your name and address for the record, but yeah, please do.
I am Leslie Tassie at 945 North Fourth Street in this town of Berthoud. I'm just wondering, where do we come in with all this? Is there, how are you letting the public know that this is being discussed besides the, people that happen to go onto the website? Because I think this is a huge issue that everybody needs to know about. Not only that, but I'm wondering if you would consider having a discussion about not only what's involved with fracking, but also what's involved with the results of fracking, which is air quality, the impact on people who are living around these fracking sites. So I think I would appreciate that you might have somebody that would represent you, like the Larimer Alliance for Health, Safety, and whatever the other one is, environment, somebody like that might talk to you too. So I just had to put in my 2 cents. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, did you respond? Okay. Anybody else want to speak to the oil and gas regulations? All are still here? Okay, seeing none, I take it nobody online wants to talk about it either? Okay. Cool. Would it be a problem at all to essentially put this again on the website where we post all of our information? Say, if you would like to weigh in on this, email us.
Yeah.
Can I believe when we originally saw the plan from the attorney that there was, one of the tranches was involved public input, if I recall right. So that to me is a critical component of this process,
Yep.
is that we kind of get our draft honed into what we think at the high level and then send it to the public feedback, and not, like you said, not just in an agenda, but to make sure that it's broadcasted so that people can come in and weigh in on that final policy
Totally.
process.
Have all these meeting notes out in the open, all our meeting packets are out in the open. I mean, all this stuff is very much well out there. But to your point, yeah, it is a big part of making sure we're doing this right for the public at large. So, okay. All right. Sounds like need a couple breaks, need a cup of coffee, things like that. All right, I guess we'll take a quick 5-minute break, if that's all right with everybody else. I'll bring it back to order. Move on to our final scheduled item for the 2023 annual budget overview, presented by our own Administrator Kirk.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem Grace and trustees. This is the kind of second step in a multi-step process that we'll go through to adopt our annual budget. As we discussed previously, we begin kind of budget development in earnest at the staff level in September and October. We presented a very rough draft budget to you on October 11th. It's a necessity, because we weren't quite ready to do that. But it did give us a chance to kind of put a handful of things into the budget that we knew were coming up for next year, things we've already discussed at the board level or projects that we're already working on, to do some initial projections, personnel expenses and other things, kind of see where we're at. Since then, we've had meetings with each department head and reviewed their budgetary requests for personnel, projects and equipment, and then other expenses related to improving programs and processes. You'll see that that's how we've organized the presentation tonight. This is intended to be an overview, not a line-by-line review of the budget. Certainly, if you have questions about specific line items, I'm happy to go through those. All of those were obviously included in your packet. It is a long budgetary document. The vast majority of our budget is carryover from year to year. The expenses that we incur for material that we use during snowplow season, right, ice slicer, those things don't typically change year over year unless we're aware of price increases, and we try to buy those things in advance. And if we know that that's coming, we'll include some change in materials. Things like office supplies, those are kind of they're different, but the costs generally remain consistent. So, a lot of the things that we budget carry over from year to year. Where we've tried to focus our presentation tonight is on the big items, anywhere where there's a significant change from last year to this year, or projects or equipment that we'd like to purchase. The big ticket items, the highlights. Again, happy to go through any details that you'd like. Based on tonight's presentation, if there are additional questions, significant changes that we need to make, we'll bring that back to you on November 22nd to review those. And then we bring it back to you for final review and adoption on December 13th. There is a December 6th date. There's actually 2 Tuesdays after Thanksgiving because we have a 5th Tuesday in November. We're going to suggest that we have a study session on December 6th to cover a couple of other items, but we could also cover budget that night as well if we needed to. So that's kind of the process there. Just at its most basic level, because we have some new members of the board, I just wanted to cover a couple of real high level basics. When you look at the budget, we account using fund accounting, right? It's a system that we use to account for funds that are limited to specific purposes, and you'll see that as we go through. It's not necessarily to track whether we make a profit, right? That's not how we're motivated in the government world, but instead that we can demonstrate accountability that the funds are used for what they're intended for. As we prepare, again, we look at, we're gonna continue to fund the existing services that we have unless there's some structural change to what we're doing based on direction that you've given. In this case, this year, there isn't any of that. But again, prioritizing the funding and continuation of the services that we already provide. Then looking at how do we fund the expansion of services, if we need more personnel because we've built new parks, or if we need to buy more trucks because we have more water operators that need to maintain a larger system, how do we deal with and fund the expansion of our services due to growth? And then lastly, how do we fund the priorities that the board has set? Priority projects, priority plans, priority programs. That's kind of the next step in the puzzle for us. Feel free to stop me at any time if you have any questions. At its highest level, since January 2018, our total fund balances were around $34 million then. Our total fund across all funds as of the end of September 2022 is around $120 million. We still have a lot of expenses left this year, right? So what you'll notice is that our total fund balance projected to begin next year with is less than that, right? Because there's still things we're paying for throughout the rest of this year. There's some big projects that we have underway. But it is likely that we could actually end up with a higher ending fund balance at the end of this year than we're projecting. And that's probably likely, but as you know, we like to budget conservatively, and that's part of the reason why we've been able to build our reserves so significantly. But despite strong growth, we are starting to see the economy slow, especially as it relates to new building in town. This is a list of some of the forecasts and reports that we reviewed and kind of trying to determine, what's next year gonna look like for us from a revenue standpoint. The broader economy generally impacts our sales and use taxes, right? It may have an impact on marijuana sales, but what it doesn't really typically have an impact on is like water sales, unless the economy's doing really bad and people can't spend money on water in their yard, and so they're cutting back there. That's kind of unusual, right? So utility revenue, will trend upward because the community's growing, and that's generally kind of consistent and reflective of growth. But, building revenue, the fees that we charge for planning review and building inspection may decline as a result of the changing building market. So again, we tried to kind of dig through a whole host of both kind of statewide and national economic forecast information from a bunch of different sources. Some in a little more detail than others, reading summaries, but what we're planning for generally is about a 13% increase in property tax revenue. And that's just driven by both the more property being developed in town, and therefore higher property tax collections and increasing values. We're planning for a 3% increase in general sales tax revenue. The state is planning for about a 4.2%, at least according to the Office of State Planning and Budgeting. 3% I think makes more sense for us. We don't have as large and diverse of an economy as we do statewide, and so as you see consumer spending decline, we may see a larger decline than you might see on average across the state. But we feel like that's a conservative number. And then we have planned a roughly a 24% decrease in building permit use tax revenue. Most of what we've seen as we look at forecasts, there's still a high risk for recession, and so a lot of the forecasts are very muddy. Job growth is still good. Household finances are strong, but interest rates are up. People are starting to spend a little less money, maybe hoping things will get cheaper in the future, and they're holding on to what they have, or maybe because they don't feel like they can afford certain things. And in most of the forecasts, it says recession is, there's a potential for recession. It's likely to be mild because of some of the economic factors I've mentioned, but it could be really bad, right? It's just kind of like, we don't really know. And so trying to be conservative, but also not, most of the forecasts we reviewed, the sky is not falling, the economic world is not coming to an end, but we also want to be conservative. We have those seen locally, regionally and at the state level. New home permits were down year over year in June by about 17%. We saw that here locally actually much more significantly. And again, I think, when you're looking at a statewide average, you would expect it to be less of a decline than you might see on a local level, right? Especially in a smaller community like ours, where, those changes can be really significant, right? But multifamily permits in June were up. And non-residential construction in several of the forecasts I've looked at is still expected to be strong in 2023. And there's some good reason for that, right? Non-residential, especially commercial construction, kind of lags behind residential growth, right? In the state, Berthoud region, we've seen this big explosion of residential growth, and now commercial is kind of coming in behind it. That's typical. And when residential growth starts to slow, commercial growth continues for a little bit, and the slowdown lags behind. So we are seeing a lot of commercial interest still in town, and that might help to balance out some of those revenues as we move into next year. Even if single family home permits decline, multifamily may continue to be strong. We've still got a lot of interest there. And the way our codes are written, it's required in all of our subdivisions, so there are places planned and already approved for townhomes and duplexes and apartments and those kinds of things. And then again, still expecting good, strong commercial growth. Locally, we had the highest monthly permit total ever in 2022 earlier this year. And then last month, it dropped to 5 single-family building permits. As soon as interest rates started to go up, new housing starts in Berthoud started to go down. And I don't think that's a surprise to anyone. That doesn't mean that trend will continue. It's also part of the local factors that are at play when we try to think about, as I've talked to Loveland, they're not predicting as big of a slowdown. But part of our struggle is we're actually starting to run out of developed lots for single family homes. So a lot of the neighborhoods that have been under construction the last several years are nearing the end of their current phases, and their new phases won't be coming online until maybe midway through next year. And so, Trails at Creek View is a good example. That project has been approved, but they haven't started construction yet. And the work that it takes to get a subdivision ready before new homes are built is months and months and months, right? Underground utility construction, road construction, parks, electrical infrastructure, on and on and on. So locally, part of why we're seeing a reduction in building permit activity is driven by macroeconomic factors, we think, and that the builders are telling us that, so that's not a secret, that they're starting to pull back a little bit. And then part of it is because we just don't have as many subdivisions that are that have a huge ton of available lots. And again, I already mentioned our commercial base isn't as large or diverse as the state, so we should expect larger adjustments than maybe you might as you average that across the state. But we're still really desirable. Again, lots of continued commercial interest, industrial interest even. So we've had a lot of meetings and interest from developers. No one's building anything yet in that regard, other than the things that you've already seen under construction. But those projects are coming, and we're confident that those will move forward in 2023. So, with respect to the board's objectives and priorities that you set for us a little bit earlier this year as a result of our retreat, the three that really require budgetary, or that have some budgetary demand are the three that I've highlighted: completing phase 1 construction of Town Park, establishing clear revenue and expense budgets to support town open space acquisition, and then establishing a 5-year sidewalk maintenance and replacement plan. Those three items are included in the budget, and I'll point those out to you as we go through. And then the others are things that we can kind of absorb within our existing overhead expense, so they don't require a dedicated budget line item. Okay, I'll stop there if anybody has any questions, or I'll just keep rolling through if you'd like. Okay, getting the thumbs up. General fund revenue, so this is, the general fund is what funds the majority of it funds all of our building and planning activities, economic development, community outreach, admin, town clerk, finance, HR. It funds a portion of the parks staff, a portion of the recreation staff, streets. What it does not fund is the utility funds. We'll get to those in a little bit. We do fund projects with the general fund. And then we also support and supplement those projects with other capital investment funds that I'll share with you in a minute. But revenue comes from a broad variety of sources, all of which are listed here. Some is intergovernmental, some are property sales tax, franchise taxes, some are related exclusively to building and planning. Some are transfers from other funds, right? Our finance and HR staff provides finance and HR services to the water and wastewater funds, right? Those businesses, and so they pay for a portion of that, for instance, right? So we cover some of that with transfers from those funds. Licensing and permitting, all the things we do there, we generate revenue through passports. That's a big part of what the front office does. That's probably the vast majority of what they do typically on a daily basis nowadays. Anyway, large variety of revenue sources for the general fund specifically. Our current projection is roughly 10 million, a little over $10 million in total revenue for the general fund in 2023. That's in line with our estimates from 2022. We are estimating that we'll exceed those initial budget estimates that were approved at the annual budget. The updated numbers are from mid-year based on actual revenue and kind of projections through the rest of the year. Where you'll see a decline is in the planning and building side. Again, those are driven by new development work and new building projects, houses, commercial buildings. A lot of those are in and out, so we collect plan review fees. We keep a portion and then we pay our plan review firm because we don't have, for engineering plan review, specifically, we pay an engineering firm to do that review for us. So some of those fees come in and go out. If we don't have the review demand, then we don't pay the engineer to review it. And so, you know, when revenue declines, the loss and expense is also there and relative, and so you don't see that as a real big negative. The intergovernmental revenue is another big ticket line item, where you see the millions of dollars in 21 and 22, that was related to ARPA funds. We got roughly $2.2 million in ARPA funds in two separate tranches. So that, spiked our intergovernmental revenue. We're not getting any more of that. So that's a little different there. Other than that, we would expect some license and permitting revenue to increase. The charges for our lease revenue here at Town Hall, the old Town Hall, we expect that to be relatively similar. The interest that we generate on the money that we have in investment accounts, all those things we would expect to be generally similar. So the big declines are no more ARPA funds and a reduction in building and planning related revenue. Taxes are, again, the biggest part of our general fund revenue, property taxes, general retail sales taxes, and building sales and use taxes. From a tax revenue standpoint, sales tax makes up the majority of our tax revenue, and property tax closely followed behind that. The building side is a small portion of our tax revenue, so again, as building declines, it has a smaller effect than if, say, consumer spending dropped dramatically. That would have a significant impact on our total general fund revenue. This is a high-level summary of expenses associated with the general fund. You'll see a very significant administration expense there. That is the expense of the ARPA funds. So there's 2.2 million plus or minus of expense that we're planning to spend next year, if assuming that you agree. So that's what's spiking that much higher. That's not an increase in salaries or an increase in office supplies. We're not spending $2 million more on paper. But again, that's a kind of a big ticket one-time item. The rest of those, the public safety increase is a result of just increasing costs associated with our sheriff's contract. It is still a very good deal for us in terms of what we get for the price that we pay. Full 24-hour coverage without any of the liability and with all of the resources and expertise that we don't have to pay for and train and develop and all those things. There's a lot of value there that's hard to quantify, but some increase in expense associated with that contract. Parks, streets, planning and building, we're actually expecting things to kind of stay the same, and we'll go through each of those departments one by one here in a minute. But what we're not really planning are increases in personnel this year. We've been really fortunate over the last 2 years to add to our staff, and the town board has helped us to do that, recruit, retain good employees with salary adjustments that we made over the last 2 years to be more on rate or more on market with our salaries, but also with kind of non-expense related items like scheduling and flexibility that we're able to offer to employees. What you will see, and what we will talk about in more detail here in a minute, is significant capital project expenses. So we've saved up a large reserve in the general fund, much higher than what we would expect to carry as a minimum ending fund balance. Our minimum ending fund balance, kind of as a general policy, is 15% of our expenses, our operating expenses, and so that's roughly $1.5 million, and what we actually have in reserves is closer to 20. So we're well beyond our minimum ending fund balance. That's consistent with the Government Finance Officers Association's recommendations of 2 months worth of revenue in reserve. So we're well beyond that. And so we think it's time to start spending some of that money on projects, and we'll tell you about what we think some of that would go to, and then there'll still be a significant amount of money left in reserve at the end of that. So again, just on a percentage breakdown, the general fund is, the administration department in the general fund looks to be much larger because of that ARPA expense. When you take that out, it makes a little more sense. Administration is about a quarter of the general fund, public safety is another quarter, and then the remaining half is broken up among the other departments. So again, general fund, each fund that we'll go through tonight, I've just kind of organized the highlights, both in people, then in projects or equipment that we would like to build or buy. And then lastly, on the next slide, and I'll come back, is process improvements or programs. Other than that, areas where it's like materials for street maintenance, I haven't included those as highlights in the budget because they're typically, again, carryovers from year to year with minor adjustments based on changing conditions, prices change or whatever. But other than that, those expenses stay pretty low. So included in the general fund, we'd like to do a lighting retrofit at Town Hall. We've been investing money in Town Hall over the last few years. We updated all of the HVAC units. They were decades old and having lots of issues, so that was a really good change. We've paid for new carpet. We're about to start on another carpet project to replace all the carpet that hasn't been all changed out. Some huge areas of carpet that are unraveling. And then next year we'd like to retrofit the lights with more energy efficient, higher quality, better qualitatively light throughout Town Hall. We also wanted to budget for some new town monument signage. It's something we've talked about a couple times before. We presented some monument sign ideas that were not well received previously. But we'd like to dust that off, get more community feedback, and maybe even have a community design contest that maybe might help inspire some new community monument welcome signage throughout town. That's independent of the CDOT signs that you see in the CDOT right of way on Mountain Avenue and 287. Those we're gonna update. They look really bad. They're all faded out. We're gonna update those already with money that we already have. We wanna install a dedicated HVAC for the server room. As you can imagine, servers, they generate a lot of heat. They need to be cool. So we wanna improve our server room to improve its functionality and hopefully durability. We budgeted each year the last few years for new electric vehicle stations. The first year we budgeted for them, they were intended to go to Wagner Farm at the rec center. They were installed, but we were able to pay for those with a grant. That was great, or at least a portion of. We're about to install 2 more here at Town Hall that we budgeted for last year. We're again gonna be able to pay for a portion of those with a grant, so that's great. That'll save some money there. And then next year, we'd like to install some downtown. We have a couple different locations where we think that might make sense. But we'll bring those to you at a later date. And all of these items as we go through, as we talk about projects, you're not approving that project tonight. You'll approve those at a later date. But we're including money here with the expectation that you would allow us to move forward, put those projects together, and then bring them back to you for approval as we go to bidding and construction. We've included money for crosswalk lights. We don't have a location determined. We have a couple of different locations where we think they would be appropriate, and this might be enough, depending on where they're located, to fund either 1 or 2. If they're on Highway 56, for instance, they're much more expensive. Dealing with CDOT, if we install them on a local road somewhere, they're a little less. But we have a little internal traffic committee that we get together about quarterly to talk about ongoing complaints that we've received, or safety issues that we've identified and how we need to address those. And so our goal would be to identify where we put those crosswalk lights in different locations around town, and then again, bring those to you to approve prior to install. We've got a handful of equipment items for maintenance work. Those are actually identified in the line items in the budget, but it's one is a mini skid steer to help with shoulder work, road shoulder work that we do. Some of those items. All of those items are for the streets to crew or the parks department. We've got 2.2 million in ARPA funds planned for the 3rd Street and Massachusetts project. There's still a lot of work to be done there. We had a great meeting with the businesses adjacent to Third Street, had good representation there and got a lot of great feedback. We're gonna make some, I think, fairly significant refinements to that project that we can bring back to you and show you as options based on the feedback we received, so that was really good. But we'd still like to build that project if we can afford it, and we'd like to invest that ARPA money in downtown. We feel like that's a worthy place to spend that money. We have some money planned out of the general fund reserve to pay for a portion of Town Park. Town Park Phase 1 you'll see in several funds as we go throughout the night, so we'll be pulling money from park development funds, 1% sales tax funds, they're dedicated for recreation purposes, the general fund to put together enough money to do the town park renovation project. We think that's probably a $5.5 to $6 million project. And actually, we're trying to get updated numbers from our consulting team. I was hoping to have them before this meeting. When we started the project, we thought it was probably a $4.5 million project. Then we did a cost estimate as we got to about 75% design plans. They said now we think it's an $8.5 million project. And we said, well, that's not gonna happen. Now we've got it down to about, I think, a $6 million project. And I think we can make some adjustments to get it back down to 5.5 where we'd kind of hope to start from the beginning. That's what's included in the total budget is $5.5 million. Again, you'll see that across different funds. And then the Richardson Park construction drawings, that's the next phase of the Parks Master Plan. Back in 2018, we said we were gonna do Wagner Farm first, and we were gonna do Town Park, and the next park after that would be Richardson. So we'd like to start, we've gotten to about 30% design there, and to get all the way to 100% design is a couple $1 million as a major park with major park amenities, as you know. So we've included some money in there for that as well. From a process improvement or a program standpoint, our animal control contract is increasing. If we wanna continue that, it has been, we contract with the Laramie Humane Society to provide animal control services. We do that in partnership with some other agencies, so we don't have to fund the entire cost of those animal control officers. One of those agencies is backed out, so everybody's cost has gone up a little bit, so that's where that change is. And then a couple of other items of note in the general fund is from a highlight perspective, the former outdoor swimming pool account is being eliminated. It's still in the budget, but you'll see it's all zeros because that pool is no longer in existence. And eventually it'll just come out entirely, I think. And then we did create a new general fund department. That's an accounting exercise. It's all still general funds in terms of the total bottom line. But for community outreach specifically. So we took the expenses that we normally had in the admin department that we were already spending on community outreach, we've taken those out so that we have kind of a dedicated spot to both pay for and track expenses there. So again, total ending fund balance, we expect at the end of this year to be around 19 million. And then we would like to spend a significant chunk of that fund balance on some of those bigger ticket items like Third and Massachusetts, Town Park, the Richardson Park Design Project, that's several $1 million of expense. And so while it looks like we may be in the red, in the budget, in the general fund summary, you'll see that there's revenue, there's operating expenses, and then we've identified capital separately so that you can see that revenue and expenses from an operating perspective were in the green or in the black, depending on what you wanna look at. And then those capital expenses then take us into the red at the bottom line, but in reality, what we're doing is spending money that we've saved on projects we'd like to execute. Any questions before I move on to enterprise funds?
Sorry, the 309,000 on the 2023 budget, there's nothing to the left of that, so I'm not sure what that.
Oh, sorry, that's the statutory minimum ending fund balance, which is 3%. Is that right, Cindy?
Yeah, it's the emergency reserve, basically.
Yeah, so there's a statutory minimum, and then we have our own kind of general policy minimum, which is 15%.
Okay.
Good question, and you'll see that throughout, so. we can always go back if anything pops into your head. So enterprise funds, different than general funds, enterprise funds are more like business units, right? They are paid for not by taxes, but by fees for service. So water rates, you pay a rate for water and we deliver water to you, right? It's more of a business unit. And we have a handful of enterprise funds. Our source of supply is what we call source of supply is our raw water fund. So as I go through each of these, I'll have a slide that's just general information about the fund, where's the revenue come from, and what are the expenses, either that we spend it on or that it is limited to by law or by ballot measure or whatever created that funding source. Source of supplies is generated by cash in lieu of water dedication. So instead of giving us water rights, you pay us to go buy new water rights. It funds new water acquisition, development of water storage, court costs as we go through and change native rights to municipal use, and other water system expansion improvement. There are no personnel expenses in this fund. There are a lot of funds that we have that don't have any personnel expenses. They're used entirely for building and acquiring. This is one of those funds. Well, the big highlights that we have budgeted here, we're still working on siting and developing a new water storage reservoir. That's to primarily firm up our Windy Gap water. We've talked about that in previous meetings. We always budget money for water acquisition so that as water rights come available, we can bring those to you. If you want to purchase them, we don't need to amend the budget to then to purchase those unless we find a really awesome water acquisition like we did last year. Ended up being more than we budgeted, and in those cases we go through and make a budget supplement as needed. And then raw water line improvements, the Carter Lake pipeline, we get our water from a couple of different places, physical places, but the majority of our water comes through the Carter Lake pipeline. Outlet works Carter Lake directly to our water treatment plant. And we're working on improvements there to get it back to its theoretical maximum capacity. We'd like to be able to pull a full 10 cubic feet per second through that pipeline. We should be able to do that, but there are some physical limitations that can be overcome with engineering and adjustments. And then there are sections that also need to be replaced because they're old, and when we start to ramp up pressure and volume, we don't want those to blow out. So combination of things to kind of maximize our ability to pull water from Carter Lake. And then on the program side, next year we'd like to complete a non-pot master plan. We updated our raw water master plan, as you know. We've talked about that a handful of times. Pete Johnson's been here to discuss that. We're working on water and wastewater master plans right now. Those are huge lifts. They'll be done early next year. But those are looking at our entire water and wastewater systems, modeling them, identifying areas where we need improvements, planning expansion of those facilities based on growth, all those things. That's kind of included in that master plan. The same is true with non-pot. And so that's kind of the next step for us. We own a lot of non-pot resources, and that's just native water that's not treated before it's delivered to the customer. There are non-pot systems that have been developed in town that we don't control, but that we influence or deliver water to. And we'd like to clean that system up. So we want to look at it holistically. Where do we get the water? How does it get delivered? What improvements need to be made to make that a more efficient system? And the real benefit of non-pot is that the more non-pot irrigation that we have, the less water we need to treat in the summertime. And expanding treatment is incredibly expensive, tens of millions of dollars. So the less we need to expand treatment, the better off we'll be in the long run financially. Hopefully that makes sense. Again, there are no personnel expenses in this account. All the funds are targeted for facilities and equipment, process and programs, and then those priority projects like purchasing water and expanding reservoirs. This fund is really healthy. It has a very healthy reserve that will allow us to do all of these things and develop, wire, and enhance our raw water resources. What you might notice is that also there were a couple of huge revenue items in previous years. Some of that is driven by when we change water price. In our water bank, we allow you to come in and purchase water in advance for lots that you already have approved. So, you know, if you have a subdivision approved and it has platted lots, you can buy that water in advance. And then you can sell that to the builder or you can transfer it to the builder. It's like a water bank, right? You're buying a share of water. Each time we've changed the water price, we've got to run on water, and so we end up collecting a huge chunk of revenue. There's obvious reasons why that's not great, because you're increasing the water cost, and they're buying it at a cheaper price. But there's really no way around that in our current, the way that we're set up. That's just the way it is. But again, our limitation is we don't sell you water. You can't just buy water just because you want to. You have to have approved platted lots. And we keep track of how many you have, how many of those lots are already wet, and we don't let you buy water for lots that you already own water for. That makes sense. Any questions about source of supply? Water operations, that's all generated through the sale of water and water meter fees. So that's our water rates. That funds the operation improvement of the town's water treatment and distribution system. We don't have any outstanding external debt. We paid off bonds that were issued in the water fund with our own money. We lent ourselves the money to pay those off. So obviously it's a better deal for us financially, and we're still paying ourselves back for that kind of internal refinance. But that'll be paid off in 2026, and there'll be no debt associated with the water fund unless the board chooses to issue more for something. We are planning increases in salary expense here for a senior operator and potentially an additional engineer. We currently rely on contract operators, and so you'll see there's professional fee expenses in the account that I've identified here. Ramey Environmental provides our contract operator services for both our water and our wastewater. That's been a really good deal. They're very good at what they do. Similar to contracting with the sheriff's department, they have other resources available, so if somebody calls in sick and we need coverage, they can pull somebody from somewhere else. We just couldn't do if we ran it ourselves. Being a small system, that can be kind of challenging. So our contract operators, that continues to be a good deal. We are going to start moving, I think, towards bringing those back in-house, and starting with some senior level operators and additional water engineers to help us along that path. We do currently have 2 distribution operators that are town employees that aren't working in the treatment plant, but that are dealing with all the distribution infrastructure to take the water from the plant to the end user. We are budgeting for water meter infrastructure replacements, both in this fund and the water capital fund that I'll show you in a second. We're replacing old outdated meters. We also want to be able to centrally read all of those meters, every meter in town. That basically means that every meter in town would talk back to a central location via radio. We can monitor those meters at any given point in time. It also gives us flexibility to let customers monitor their meters much more closely at any given point in time. They can identify leaks as they occur, right? The meter can be set to say, hey, if there's continuous flow of X amount of gallons for, X amount of time, that's typically a leak. We can alert the customer, they can figure out where that leak is. Save water and save themselves some money. So expending some money to upgrade meter infrastructure, we have planned. There's some operating capital expenses. Most of what is identified in both the water and wastewater funds are placeholders. As we're going through the water and wastewater master plans, we're already identifying projects that we know we need to execute, but they're not fully refined yet. And so Ken Matthews, our utility director, said, look, I think we're gonna need about this much money to do some of these initial priority projects that result from the master plan. I don't know exactly what those are yet. I have an idea, but I'm not gonna commit to them yet. But I also wanna show that we need to spend that money, and so we've included money in the budget to deal with some of those items, knowing that they're gonna be coming up early next year. And then a new water operations vehicle if we hire a new senior operator, so that they'll have a vehicle to drive. And then potentially contracting with Little Thompson for treatment capacity. They have a much larger plant than we do. We're already interconnected. And so if we need additional treatment capacity, we could contract with them to use up some of the existing treatment capacity that they have and then that can just be delivered directly into our system. And again, we already take water from them, we already pay them for water every year. This might expand that if it's a need, and that's kind of a placeholder item as well, as a short-term capacity expansion improvement. And in that case, we would be delivering our water to them to treat, if that makes sense. Again, on the operating side, you know, from an expense standpoint, here we again are expending, you know, a couple $1 million in capital and equipment that needs to be purchased with funds that we have saved up, and so that's why you see a higher expense item than you see revenue. But operationally, we're generally okay. We are not proposing rate increases again. This will be the fifth year in a row now, or sixth. As a result, and we've talked about this before, we don't wanna set new rates until we finish the water and wastewater master plans, because we need to identify the improvements that those rates need to pay for. So next year, we will be finalizing water and wastewater rate studies. Those are already going on right now in parallel with the water and wastewater master plans. They just won't be done before next year, and we're financially healthy enough that we don't need to increase rates next year. Water capital, these are generated by system investment fees. You're gonna see that term a lot. They're also called impact fees or mitigation fees. Those kind of terms are all used synonymously. But generally, they're fees paid by new development, either by the developer or the builder, depending on which fee it is. The water capital side, that's typically paid at the building permit phase, so the builder pays these fees, and it's designed to mitigate the impact of new development on our existing customers. So our current system serves our current customers just fine. As we add customers to that system, we're collecting fees to then expand the system as needed, so that the existing customers don't have to foot that whole thing, right? And that would be, so this is kind of growth paying its own way. That's what these fees are intended for. There are no personal expenses in this fund either, because it's designed to increase the capacity of our system. This is, you know, we would like to pay for some of our meter reading equipment out of here as well, to improve and enhance infrastructure. We also believe that that will increase some capacity as our meter reading gets better. Our water usage would actually likely drop a little, and increase some capacity. We do need to create a water loop through Richardson Park. I think we talked about that previously with the bike park project. That would get installed at the same time as the bike park is being built. But it would loop a water main through Richardson Park down to some areas of the south that don't have water redundancy, and so there can be pressure issues. There could also be issues when there's a break and we have to shut off that entire part of town. This would allow us to fix some of those problems. We wanna complete some water treatment plant improvements. This is another one of those placeholders. Oh, no, I apologize. This one is not. This one is filter media at the wastewater, or at the water treatment plant. One of the constrictions that we have in our treatment processes is that the filters, the water gets treated and it goes through filters right before it goes into the system. Because of how we backwash those filters, there's some limitation on how much water we can push through. So if we improve the filter media and we also add air, inject air into those filters, it can scrub those filters out and increase our ability to push water through them. That's as much as I know, if I'm being honest. But
That's what Ken said, right?
yeah, I am regurgitating what Ken explained to me that I do understand generally, but I could not explain to you why that works. But again, that's to add back some capacity to our plant without having to do major overhauls and major improvements. And then the Loveland Reservoir ditch pump is improving our ability to deliver non-pot water primarily to Wagner Farm Park. There is it's a long story, but there's at the outlet of Loveland Reservoir, the water goes into a ditch that then gets carried off to be delivered to other locations in town. We pull water out of that ditch with a pump, and it doesn't work. And if we can't pull water out of that ditch with that pump, then we can't deliver non-pot water to Wagner Farm, and we have to water with potable water, which we don't wanna do. So we always expected to have to use some potable water in the shoulder seasons, but during the hottest part of the year, we wanna be using irrigation water, not treated potable water. So this would help us fix that problem. And again, we did include placeholder expenses, and what you'll see in the budget document is those are carried forward over the next 5 years. A lot of these expenses are one-time, where you see them carried forward in over the next 5 years. Those are just, estimates and placeholders, but knowing that we're gonna have some expenses that result as a result of the water and wastewater master plans.
Does the school district have access to that pump once we get it working?
Yeah, so we share that. It goes into a shared system. We then take water out of that system to Wagner, and they take water over to Turner. But yes, that would improve their ability to then water Turner with non-pot as well. And then we just have some expense to complete the water and wastewater master plans that'll carry into next year. That's just a portion of the expense. The majority of that was paid for this year. Again, here, while we do have some big ticket items to pay for, we are still projecting an increase in the ending fund balance. And, $11 million sounds like a lot, but if we have to expand our water treatment facility, that will all be gone in one project. So it's important that we save that money up, so that we have those big ticket capacity expansions, we have the money ready to do that. Wastewater operations, it's generated from utility fees, sewer rates, funds our operation and improvement of the town's water, wastewater collection and treatment. So we produce water, it goes through houses and businesses, and then the waste gets collected and treated. Bonds were issued in that fund back in 2012, and payoff will occur in 2023.
2023 or 2032?
32, did I say 23? Sorry.
Yep.
2032, 20-year note. A portion of our water fund personnel is included in wastewater operations. The majority of the personnel expense there is actually contract operators, so it doesn't show up in salaries, it shows up in professional fees in the budget. Again, some of our distribution operators also support the collection system work, but the plant we already talked about. We do wanna make some solids handling improvements at the I'm sorry, that says regional wastewater treatment plant, that's actually at the main plant. Those are process improvements, you'll actually get to see those in December when we go to take a tour. You'll get to see what we intend to do. Part of the treatment process we need to inject air into, and that air gets used by the bugs that are in the water to break down the solids. Again, chemistry I only marginally understand, but
It's pretty cool.
it's really cool. But we wanna add blowers to that aeration basin where we're adding air into the mix. And if you get the air mixed just right with the bugs that are in the water, they'll break down the waste more efficiently. And again, ongoing capital replacement placeholders driven by the master plan. And then an increase in annual sewer inspection costs. Oops. I should know that one off the top of my head, and I do not. I have to pull up my notes. I appreciate Cindy is here. She knows as much or more about all of this than I do, so I'm doing the talking, but if you have detailed questions, she can always come up and help clarify the things I'm explaining. And this is all a representation of her hard work, so don't let me fool you, I didn't do any of these spreadsheets. Other than to mess them up and send them back to her for her to clean. So I'll take a moment to
That's the line cleaning.
Oh, thank you. I put sewer inspections because I didn't type out the whole line item. It's cammering and cleaning our wastewater collection lines, our sewer lines. Thank you, Cindy. That's something we do every year, but we're expecting to increase costs next year to do a little more than we do on an annual basis. Here again, we have some bigger ticket capital expenses on the operations and maintenance side. About just under $2 million. And so that's where you're seeing that deficit. Operationally, we're just fine, but we're spending some money on making some needed upgrades. Wastewater capital, again, that system expansion fee, and it's designed to increase the capacity of the system as a result of new growth. No personnel expenses. Improvements at the headworks for the regional wastewater treatment plant. The regional plant out by I-25 serves Loves and Serenity Ridge and will be serving any other growth that occurs out there. We get interest out there all the time, not just from Turion, which will have to do a major expansion that they will pay for, but from other properties in that area that would like to develop. Before they do, we need to improve the ability of that plant to treat the existing waste stream and the next phase of growth. And this is really just screening at the headworks. So the headworks is where the wastewater comes into the plant. As you can imagine, there's all kinds of gross stuff in there, rags and 2x4s, and you'd be amazed at what makes it into the sewer system. Those foul up the treatment processes, so we have screening capability at our main plant. We do not have screens at our regional plant. These screens would stop that stuff from getting into the plant, and then it would automatically pull that material out.
Is that like the auger system that we saw at the main plant?
Very similar.
Is that the screen? Okay.
Yeah, I think the actual brand name is called the Muffin Monster. I just think that's fun. We get to see that at the main plant. The First Street Sanitary Sewer and Lift Station, there's a major trunk main that runs down First Street, from up by 287 all the way back down First Street, and then eventually to our main wastewater treatment plant. That line is at or very near at capacity. And so to allow the next phase of growth to occur, that line needs to be upgraded.
Is that the old sewer plant that you're talking about?
No, well, that's where I think it went originally.
Yeah.
That plant on First Street was abandoned, so the line turns and goes over to County Line Road.
That's where we're talking about that general area.
Yeah, well, it's just, if you think about First Street running from 287 to Mountain Avenue, it basically runs parallel to First Street. And it carries wastewater from Prairie Star, parts of Campion, all, development all the way down, kind of the east side of First Street. And so there'll be kind of two phases. We'll do a lift station first to take the sewage from Prairie Star and pump it the other direction, back to Berthoud Parkway, and that'll free up space in the line while we build a bigger line to serve, the next kind of phase either north of 287 or east of First Street. Those areas that are planned for growth in the comp plan.
A lot of the alligators grow bigger and stuff.
Yeah. Thankfully, no alligators in our sewer system. Placeholder expenses for master plan improvements. Even with some large expenses here, capital expenses will still have a good healthy fund in the wastewater capital fund, and our current main wastewater treatment plant still has a lot of capacity. It's kind of like, it's the worst business to be in because you have to build all the capacity before you need it. So you gotta spend a whole ton of money even though you don't have customers yet. But that was done, 10 years ago, and there's still a lot of capacity in that plant, so we're in good shape. Stormwater capital, exactly what it sounds like, system impact fees, designed to fund projects that increase the capacity of our stormwater management and collection system. So all the stormwater runoff that goes through town that we have to manage and basically get back to the river where it belongs. There's no personal expenses in this fund either, it's capital, and the only project that we have currently budgeted is some improvements to the outfall of Berthoud Reservoir, so that stormwater that gets into Berthoud Reservoir can be released more efficiently and effectively back to its natural drainage pathways down to the river, the Little Thompson River specifically. And the amount of revenue that we would expect to collect this year from new system investment fees is roughly what we would spend on that Berthoud Reservoir, so our fund balance will stay about where it is. Stormwater operations, just like water and wastewater operations, these are generated through stormwater fees that are included on utility bills, and that pays for us to manage our stormwater system, manage and operate the stormwater system. It also includes, this is something that I think a lot of people don't think about or realize, but street sweeping is a stormwater expense. We're primarily sweeping the streets, not because, I mean, everybody loves it when the streets are clean and they're swept, but the real benefit is we're keeping all that debris and pollution out of the stormwater systems that clog up pipes, cause flooding, that deliver pollutants back to the river. So street sweeping is actually a stormwater management expense. But again, the same is true with, there is some expenses included in stormwater, not totally for street sweeping or for snow removal, but we also wanna keep snow from damming up and blocking stormwater, so we pay for some of that out of our stormwater operations funds. All of that said, we do not include personnel expenses in this fund currently. We could, but we don't. We don't have any projects planned. There's no needed operations or maintenance projects. The good thing about stormwater is there's no treatment infrastructure, it's just pipes underground, primarily and some open drainage basins. But we do wanna conduct a master drainage plan update, so looking at our total stormwater system, modeling new development, new impervious surface, increase in runoff, where does that go? How does it get routed back to the river?
Would it also address any issues where we see poor drainage that's happened?
It could, where we see localized areas of flooding because the street is too low or the curb is, at the wrong height or deteriorated, it won't address those types of things. Those aren't really master plan level issues, they're just failed curb and gutter or improper grading. I just noticed one last week, unfortunately, in an area where we just fixed, so we're gonna have our crews go out and look at and see why that is as bad or worse than it was before we did the repairs there, so. But those aren't things we would identify in the master plan necessarily. And again, modest expenses, decent revenue, collecting some funds to improve our stormwater system in the future. Now on to special funds, there are some impact fee accounts in these as well, but they're not related to enterprise funds, which is why we don't keep them in here. Enterprise funds are really just water, wastewater, and stormwater. But special funds are very limited in their use. So they have a specific revenue source, one or two, typically, and then they are heavily restricted on what they can be used for. So park development is the first one, Fund 31. That revenue is generated by system impact fees. Again, as growth occurs, there's increased pressure on our parks. We then need to be able to expand our park system so that the availability of parks doesn't diminish as growth occurs. So it funds those projects that enhance and expand our parks and recreation system. There are no personnel expenses in this fund. We actually don't have any projects we have parks projects planned, but we don't intend to pay for them out of this fund this time around. That's primarily because we've spent a lot of money out of this fund in the last 5 years, and we wanted to build back a solid bank. We would expect at the end of this year, if all things go according to plan, we'd be back to about $1 million in that fund.
Can I ask what the $60 is for?
It's a priority project right there.
I don't know, let's see.
Each fund shares in the bank fees that we have to pay.
Thank you, Cindy.
Okay, thank you.
There you go. See? I told you she knows more about this.
Right.
I look at the big stuff. Park acquisition is similar. While the park development fee pays to build parks, park acquisition fees are collected at new building to buy more parks when we need to. So this funds the acquisition of lands for parks and open space. That's all it can be used for. We obviously then have no personnel expenses. The only expense we have planned here isn't actually an expense. It's a transfer to an open space fund. One of the priorities that we talked about was establishing kind of a clear place where we're gonna take put money into and expend for open space acquisition or preservation. So now we know, we have a lot of funds that can pay for open space, but we've never really dedicated money to that purpose. It's just been there if you wanted to use that instead of something else. What we're suggesting now is that we'll start to build a little bit of a bank specifically for open space preservation and acquisition, consistent with the priorities that you guys set at your retreat. So that will go to the open space account that I'll show you here in a minute. Out of the park acquisition fund. That's only a portion of the expense there, but it's a chunk of the revenue, and that's mostly just because we expect revenue to decline because this is driven entirely by building and specifically by, almost exclusively by single-family home construction, although multifamily does pay into this. But like commercial projects don't have, they don't reduce the capacity of parks, they don't pay park fees like a house would. Public facilities fee, another system investment fee, and it's designed to mitigate the impact of new development on our public facilities and major equipment. That's specifically for like town hall, public works, parks, public safety. As growth has occurred, we've kind of we've basically reached the limits of what we can accommodate in terms of personnel here at town hall without a major redesign or without kicking out some of our current tenants. We've already notified one of them that we don't intend to renew their lease because we're gonna need that space in the next 2 years. They have lots of notice to figure out where they go next, but we will probably not continue to lease out some of that space. And then we'll need to spend some money to revamp that space and make it functional for what we do. Those are the kinds of things this fund might pay for. And in that vein, the only expense that we have in this fund for this year is some feasibility and design and initial concept designs for both a public works facility and a town hall expansion. You might be wondering, we just built a new streets facility a few years ago. We built it at the water plant with the expectation that as our water operations grew, that they could move into that facility. And then we could then build a big public works facility that would then consolidate all of our parks, streets, forestry, open space, all of those public works departments into one facility. They're spread out now across a few. So we'd like to start that planning work, knowing that we're not gonna build that yet, but start to identify where that location would go, how big it would need to be to accommodate our current demands and then some growth, and then what that might look like and how much it might cost. The same would be true for town hall. Again, we're kind of reaching the limits of what we can, who we can fit here, and we have some expansion needs in personnel that we know we're gonna have in the next couple of years, assuming that the economy doesn't completely just collapse. And so starting to plan for those improvements as well.
They're approaching it in 9:30.
Yep, I was just gonna mention,
Yeah.
thank you, Attorney Smith.
It's getting kind of close to that time where we need to move on expanding how much time we have to discuss this.
So the good news is, there's only a few more funds left. But then we have questions, if you'd like to continue, you guys have your own policy where you need to vote to continue beyond 9:30.
Okay.
Or we can come back on the 22nd and finish from there, so it's up to you.
I'll make a motion to continue to 10:30.
To 10:30, is there a second?
Can we end it at 10 by chance?
I will be done long before 10:30, but it will be up to you guys how long you wanna go.
So we have a counter offer of 10, does anybody wanna take that?
I will take 10.
10 o'clock, okay, so we have a motion
And
at 10 o'clock.
I'll second.
Okay, can we get a
If
roll
we
call?
don't, can I,
Or what?
ma-
Make an additional motion.
well, I just have a question for you guys then. If we don't get to reports, would in the motion, would that be to table reports until the next meeting, or would we have to vote again at 10 to continue the meeting to continue with reports?
We would need to, I think, vote to continue with reports, cause it's an official part of the meeting.
You
So, be concise, that's all. Just that easy, guys. Got it.
We can do this.
So we have 10 PM,
Start at 10.
and a second on the 10 PM. Do you just wanna do a roll call real quick, or just raise your hands?
Trustee Ayers? Trustee Sorcelli?
Yes.
Trustee Butler?
Yes.
Trustee Hardy?
Yes.
Trustee Murphy,
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem Grace.
Yes. Okay. So on the public facilities side, again, still healthy ending fund balance there, and slightly increasing ending fund balance. Conservation Trust Fund, this is funded through the state. The funding gets received quarterly and is on a per capita basis. It has some restrictions about what it can be used for. But primarily what we fund out of the Conservation Trust Fund is forestry and open space. We don't have any new employees planned for 2023. No major projects, but we do have an increase in expense for our ongoing emerald ash borer response program. As you know, we've been treating the trees in town, the ash trees in town, all the specimen trees, the healthy large ones that Paul, our town forester, inspects and monitors. We've been treating those on a rotating basis. Not all of them get treated at once. And this is just a reflection of increasing costs and changes to that program, but continuing to treat those trees and try to prolong their lives as long as possible. Conservation Trust, it's mostly net as proposed this year in terms of what we would expect to collect in revenue and what we expect to expend. That fund never really carries a real healthy balance, but we also don't pay for large projects out of this fund either. Larimer County Open Space Fund, this is generated by the Larimer County Open Space quarter-cent sales tax that's shared between the county and municipalities. Uses include conserving natural areas and open space, protecting water bodies, operating and maintaining parks and trails, and ag preservation. We don't have any personnel expenses in this fund. We do plan to pay for the expansion or the creation of the pickleball courts at Wagner Farm Park from this fund. We expect to keep this total construction cost, including construction administration and other things, within that $850,000. And then we do have some ongoing maintenance expenses. They're about $10,000 a year for each of these parks or open space areas: Hillsdale, Jeskowski, Richardson, and Bertha Reservoir.
How does this affect the property to the southwest of town that the county's not talking about selling?
It doesn't. That's an interesting, so the county is gonna come on November 22nd to talk to you about the farm that they are planning to sell, that the town paid for a portion of, that we would get our money back from if they sell. They'll talk to you about what that plan is, what the plan always was, which is different than I think what has been suggested. But that's a county property and it's a county project and it has no impact on us here.
Unless we wanna buy it.
Unless we would wanna buy it, but I would suggest that we not. And we'll talk about all that on the 22nd and I'll explain why. Same reason why the county doesn't wanna own it, I think. But here's where we've created this open space acquisition account. So you'll see that in Fund 36. Specifically, oops, I had it open here a second ago. Specifically down towards the bottom of that fund's page, there's an open space acquisition line item. And again, we don't have any expenses planned this year, but we do intend to transfer money in this year, and then we would expect, if the board wanted to continue that, we would do that annually from both the Park Dedication Fund, we already talked about, and then from the 1998 1% fund, which would be up in just a sec. But the Open Space Fund, the big ticket item here is the Wagner Farm Park construction, again, using some money that we have saved up to build that facility consistent with the approved uses for that funding. Cemetery Fund, revenue here is generated from lot sales in the cemetery, fees that we charge for opening and closings, which are obviously related to burials, and then transfer from the general fund to help make sure that that fund is healthy enough to continue operating the green lawn, maintaining the green lawn cemetery.
How much more capacity do we have out there, and are there plans in doing things differently or building something new someplace else?
So we own the west field, kind of west of where all the existing sites are.
So there's the opportunity to expand to the west. Michelle is,
So kind of where we collect trees and stuff, or it's like a tree lot.
that's where we did that once before, yeah.
We, at the rate that we're going, we still have maybe, I would say, 3 to 4 more years before we have to think about moving to the other section.
We have made some irrigation improvements there in the last couple of years. We still need to make some more. The areas kind of on the north end of the cemetery look, if you've been out there lately, they look much better. We made some good irrigation improvements out there. Those are I forget the term. The headstones, the flat headstones.
Flat markers.
Flat markers, thank you. The flat markers, it's much easier to maintain those. As you can imagine, we can drive lawnmowers through there much easier than we can in the area where there are raised headstones. In the older areas of the cemetery, as you can imagine, installing underground irrigation is a real challenge in a cemetery for obvious reasons, and so improving irrigation in the older areas and so that we can keep it looking better than it does today. We are gonna be working on irrigation projects there, and there's money in the budget for irrigation enhancement projects and other funds. We spend money on those every year. We'll be spending some of that at the cemetery, but not particularly out of this fund. This is just the bare minimum maintenance expenses that we have there. Any improvements that we did there would likely have to be paid for out of the general fund because we already subsidized this fund out of the general fund to keep it operating. But no new personnel, no major projects planned in this fund, and no real improvements to process programs, just continued basic maintenance and openings and closings. And that fund balance stays pretty level, but again, that's because we typically subsidize with the general fund to keep it kind of at a steady rate. And the proposed subsidy from the general fund this year is $20,000. It's not a huge chunk of money, but it is an expense. BATS, Fund 39, combination of funds from the 1998 1% fund, funding through the Office on Aging, some regional transit funds that get routed through the city of Fort Collins and back to us, and then client contributions, which is a very small portion of our revenue, but some folks that ride the bus do pay. And that just operates and maintains the BATS system. While we don't have new personnel plan, no major projects, we are going to be bringing you the results of our kind of transit assessment feasibility study before the end of the year. And that might change how we look at this fund next year. But for the time being, the only increase really in expense there is an increase in contribution to RAFT. They provide services for seniors and disabled folks. And they will pick up folks in town on either days when we're not operating or outside of our normal operating hours, and then we've been contributing funds towards RAFT for those services. And they've submitted a request for an increase in funding, and we think that's appropriate based on their outline of expenses. They keep track of how many trips they provide and how long those trips are and all of those things. So they've asked for an increase in contribution. The BATS fund is one of those, again, the transfer, the service, it doesn't pay for itself even in the slightest. The client contributions are $2,500 of the total revenue that's generated in that fund. I mean, it's almost nothing, so that's entirely supported by taxes and grants. Excuse me, and so, the ending fund balance could increase if we wanted to transfer more money in there, but there's no reason to do that today. Again, I think we might all look at this a little differently after the results of our transit assessment feasibility study, and there's some opportunities to change how we operate, but it would be more expensive. So we'll have to make a decision if we want to do that or not. You'll have the opportunity to look at that for the first time in December. Road impact funds, system investment fees designed to expand the street network. We can expand the streets, road widening, intersection improvements, roundabouts, new road connections that don't exist. There are no personnel expenses in that fund. We would like to widen a significant portion of Berthoud Parkway to allow for bike lanes, improve traffic capacity. And then we'd also like to design intersection improvements at County Road 14 and Berthoud Parkway. That intersection is a little wonky. We own it. It is in our jurisdiction, even though on the others, just north of that intersection is the county. But we'd like to improve that intersection, turn lanes, improve pedestrian accessibility and some other things there. So we wanna
Would that
start,
also-
start design work there.
Would that also add like curbing and stuff between like 10E and 287, where there's no curb on the west side or east side?
We may choose to do that as part of the Berthoud Parkway widening. We don't have that currently planned. We're a little more focused on the asphalt than the curb and gutter. But
It just
depending on
looks
bid
unfinished there.
prices, we might be able to do that, yeah.
It just looks unfinished a lot of places along there.
It does. That is a weird legacy that will not be the case in the future. The town's prior policy was that developers didn't have to expand major collectors and arterials. I'm not sure why. We've changed that since I got here, but those developments were all approved under different rules. And so while they had to do some widening associated with traffic demands, they weren't required to finish the road. Which is odd, but that's no longer, our standard now is you finish the road adjacent to your property. So, new developments, that won't be the case, it won't look unfinished. But I understand what you mean, trustee Hardy. So again, the widening project, this is just one of those instances where you save up money and then have a big expense all at once. Retail marijuana tax, this is generated through tax collected on the sale of retail marijuana, and that, when that tax was created, it was specifically limited to youth activities and services, streets and sidewalks improvements, law enforcement, and parks and recreation. The youth carnival that the Youth Advisory Commission put on was paid for from this fund as a youth activity or service. We do want to complete the 5-year sidewalk replacement plan that we talked about as a priority project that the board identified for us. We'll work with our consulting engineering firm we have assessments of all the streets, the sidewalks in town, to update those. Those were done 4 years ago. So do an updated evaluation and then put a plan in place for how do we start to replace and repair those and where do we focus the money over the next 5 years. We do pay for sidewalk replacement here where we feel like we need it, either because of safety issues or areas in downtown that we think need attention and priority, or adjacent to our other projects. So when we do road repaving, we update sidewalks adjacent to that typically. And so we pay for some of those sidewalk improvements through this fund and another fund. And then lastly, as part of Parks and Recreation in this fund, the bike park scope expansion, as you know, we brought that to you. We all agreed we'd do the entire kind of biggest scope out of the 3 options that we had, and we'll pay for that increase in cost from this fund. And then lastly, we do contract with Wildfire Arts Center to provide arts programming. It's much less expensive than hiring another recreation coordinator to focus exclusively on arts programming. It also means they use their facility for those programs instead of ours, so that frees up space in our rec center. That's been a good partnership this year. We're expecting it to continue next year. And what you'll see there is, again, a big ticket item in the bike park, bringing our fund balance down at the end of the year. We'll have to monitor cash flow there because some of what we'll be spending is what we're collecting throughout the year. But we feel confident based on prior sales data and trends that we'll be able to do that just fine. The 1998 1% sales tax, this is our second to last fund. Approved in 1998 by the voters. It's the funds can only be used for this very long list of items. But what it basically is the rec center, street improvements, open space, the former Berthoud Public Library, which we no longer operate, the BATS system, that's where we transfer money into the BATS fund to help support its operation. And then in 2019, Voters also expanded the use to include any construction, operation, maintenance of parks, open space, recreation and trails. So it gave us some more flexibility where we can spend that money. There are no personnel expenses in this fund. This is the big chunk of sidewalk replacement and maintenance money that we use when we go through and do major road repaving projects. We've been spending $1 million a year on asphalt for the last couple of years and almost $1 million for several years before that. We're gonna continue that 5-year asphalt maintenance plan next year. And that's about, and that is $1 million a year for 5 years. There is also the transfer to the new open space acquisition account. So like we looked at before, we transferred some money in from park acquisition fees. We'll transfer the other half of that money in from this fund. And this fund was intended to pay for open space acquisition, so it's a good place to take the money from. The I-25 roundabout improvements and artwork, those street improvements, as CDOT begins to wrap up their work out at the interchange at I-25, you've seen the artwork, and went through and approved the artist to do that work, and then all the landscaping associated with the improvements to those roundabouts. We'd like to bring that back to you on December 6th. That's one of the items we'd like to review with you at that study session I mentioned earlier this evening, along with a list of other items. And then town park redevelopment, this is another I mentioned we're gonna cobble together money from a few different funds to do that town park redevelopment. This is one of those places. And then lastly, again, we transfer money to support bats out of this fund. This fund has some big capital project expenses, and then we would allow it to build up over the next year or two to start to do some more big capital projects. But we can still continue to fund annually the $1 million in street maintenance and our sidewalk improvements that we've been doing as new revenues generated from sales taxes. And a lot of these funds, I'll mention I guess here, our current fund balances are much higher than what you're seeing here. Again, we have expenses through the end of the year, so we don't count our chickens before they're hatched. I expect that our ending fund balances at the end of this year will be higher than what we've projected. So we'll actually be better off financially than what we're showing here. But we'd rather show you where we think we're gonna be on the off chance that something happens between now and the end of the year, and that's not the case. Lastly, the 2019 1% sales tax. Again, these are sales taxes on general retail sales and building permits. And those funds shall be used according to the ballot language for parks and recreation needs, including but not limited to expanding and improving trails, renovating and replacing aquatic facilities, developing a rec center and related facilities, developing athletic fields, and lastly, operating parks and recreation improvements. So what we primarily pay for out of here is the operation of the rec center. This is our rec center fund, but we also carry a balance here that we could then use to build new park amenities. We'd like to add some free weight equipment to the rec center. We get a lot of feedback about that. We need more, and that's a good problem to have. It's well utilized. And then we'd like to start setting money aside for the capital replacement costs for that fitness equipment. It's very expensive. It shouldn't need to be replaced for 7 to 10 years, but we're gonna start to set aside money now so that when 7 to 10 years comes, that we'll have a bank of money to pay for all that fitness equipment replacement. And then the real big ticket item is town park redevelopment. So again, pulling from this sales tax fund to fund the majority of the town park redevelopment project. And then there are minor changes to our indoor recreation programming. From a expense standpoint, we pay for outdoor recreation almost generally from the general fund, and then we pay for indoor recreation at the rec center from this fund. So that's where that split occurs. We do have recreation expenses in the general fund that you saw. But again, that's our outdoor programs, and then indoor programs are here in this fund. And it's kind of easier to just keep all the rec center expenses in one place, if that makes sense. Good news is, operating revenue at the rec center outperformed our 2022 budget estimates. We were conservative, we told you that last year, because we've never operated a rec center before, so we weren't gonna be, even though I think I said then, I'm confident we're gonna exceed those projections, I just don't know by how much. The good news is, our memberships and daily visits are a little more than 35% roughly than what we had originally budgeted, so that's good news. And our expenses have been on track all year long, so our staff's doing a really good job managing that facility. At the end of next year, if we spend that $3 million on the town park redevelopment project, that'll bring our fund balance down a lot, but that fund actually will replenish relatively quickly, assuming that sales taxes continue to increase year over year. So, all the expenditure items in red here, these expenditure items are driven almost exclusively by where the overages beyond our revenues are driven almost exclusively by these large capital projects. And being able to go and build and buy equipment, buy land, and build projects. And we're fortunate to be able to do that and then still have a really healthy ending fund balance at the end of the year. As I mentioned, our current total fund balance at the end of September 2022 was actually $120 million. What we're projecting at the end of this year and therefore the beginning of 2023 is actually $97 million. Again, I think we may exceed that, but we're not gonna count our chickens before they're hatched. And so if we end up in a much more positive financial condition at the end of the year, then that'll be great. We'll make those adjustments at mid-year next year. We'll collect a little over $33 million we expect in revenue across all funds, and then spend that money both operating and then building and buying new stuff. And our ending fund balance would still be, even in that condition, assuming that we don't end up better than we think, we'd still have roughly $75 million in the bank across all funds. And all of our funds are healthy and able to continue to do the things that we need to do and the things that we want to do and still have money for the future. So that's kind of my summary. Happy to answer as many questions as you have. We can store those up and go through them all on the 22nd as well, if you'd prefer, since we were 10 minutes before 10.
Is that all right with everybody? Any
If
questions?
there's any you want that we can address tonight, I'm happy to do that too.
Just in the effort of conserving time, we can also email it off. Is my thought. Anybody opposed to that? No. Okay.
If you email me questions, what I'll do is I'll respond to you, but then we'll also bring those back to the next meeting, and I'll let everybody know what the question was and what the answer was, so that's all open to everybody.
Awesome. All right.
Time for lead reports.
Yep, officer reports. Start on this side of the table. Let's see if we can give Administrator Kirk a second or two to catch his breath and rest his voice.
I got a long list. I'm just kidding.
Better not.
I'm just kidding.
Trustee Butler, any executive reports?
I don't have any.
No reports, all right. Trustee Sorcelli? Nothing to report? Go for it. Do it. Be the guy.
Well, the main issue with Port Committee meeting last week was pickleball and the Jiskowski property. Pickleball was just kind of community feedback. Everybody was happy as the project is moving forward. No real things to comment about on that. The Jiskowski property took up most of the took up most of the conversations. And luckily enough, the Loveland Disc Golf Association was there, and they really commented on a lack of large-scale disc golf, which isn't something really that the Port Committee had thought was one of the main possibilities for the property. So staff is gonna talk to Colorado Open Lands about that. The continued issue is not the ideas that Port wants to provide to the board for suggestions as to what to do with the Jiskowski property. It's the vague answers that Colorado Open Lands is giving back to them. It's a consistent concern, however, once again, in the interest of time, I will not go into specifics, but when the Jiskowski property comes up in front of us, I will have all of the Port Committee comments in detail, as well as the questions and answers that have already been asked and vaguely answered to the committee.
Okay.
Let's see, there was, Jeff Hyman asked a question about the speed limit on 54 transitioning from 25 to 30.
You mean 56?
56, yeah, what'd I say?
Or Mountain Ave.
54. I thought CDOT controlled,
They do.
so nothing we can do really.
We can ask.
Okay.
We've asked for modifications to the speed limit on other stretches of 56 and been told thanks, but no thanks.
Okay.
But yeah, the answer to that is, I'm not sure why CDOT did that.
Okay. Especially next to a school, that seems a little weird, but
It does.
I guess
I mean, I think I know the answer just cause I know how their traffic planning works.
because they're trying to get people out of town, yeah. I guess,
And the road widens, so the design speed limit there is higher than where it's narrow through town.
I guess would that be one of the opportunities for one of the lit crosswalk? Oh wait, is it already lit there?
We already have a lit
Yeah, it's already
crosswalk.
lit there, so never mind. I guess another question I had on that same note was if you contact them in the future again, I've seen in the roundabout on First, people go real fast through that and it actually slows down traffic because people go too fast and you can't sort of jump in line.
Just be glad we don't have a wall there so we can pull that NASCAR move.
I saw a truck drive just straight across the other day, which is always fantastic to see. So that just came into my mind based on the information or from the email, but I assumed that CDOT controlled those lines. I have contacted a couple of municipalities around the area about how they designate and what the specifications are for their intermediary trail systems. This came up in a conversation we had about the Vantage Trail that's going next to the ditch. I'm waiting to hear back from them and I will give you guys more information about their trail standards, and Port seemed amenable to possibly reevaluating the standards and making them wider. But once again, I don't have enough information to give to you guys on that. And everything else that I wanted to talk about can be pushed forward to our next meeting.
Okay,
Thank you.
alright. Trustee Murphy?
Yeah, I've got a few short things. Just had a really good idea, or actually I should give credit to my wife on this one. Regarding social media, I thought it'd be a good idea to basically have an employee highlight that's kind of notifying the community, like
It's funny that you
what
mentioned
their
that.
staff is about and stuff, so.
We're actually doing that as part of our newsletter next month, and then those will get
Excellent.
highlighted on social media, so.
I'll shut my mouth.
We're gonna do it by department, but
That's great.
Yeah. great
Um,
suggestion.
let's see, yeah, it's great to see the Fickle Park bathroom finally in place. Thanks to all the staff that have worked on that. And then the last thing, I've been participating in this energy efficiency cohort as an observer of all the communities south of here. We just wrapped up our last meeting last Friday, kind of laying out a roadmap to new construction in 2030. They're compiling kind of the results of the discussions that we kind of went through and stuff, and I hope to share some of that with you guys in the near future if you guys are interested.
Absolutely.
So that'll be forthcoming probably in the new year. And that's all I've got
That's all
tonight.
you got.
Yep.
Trustee Hardy, any reports?
We've got a couple things. We wanted to say thanks for putting the departmental reports back in our emails to us. I like reading those and seeing what all the parks and rec and
Oh, yeah.
trees and everybody's building stuff and
Those go
fixing
in the
stuff.
packets too, I know you guys see that.
Mhm.
So I like that, seeing that again. Ditto on the Fickle Park bathrooms. Nothing in historic preservation other than one of our members did meet with Mark French. We're trying to do some collaboration events there. It was brought up to maybe look at doing like the home tours again, but most likely we'll do walking tours, focus more on that. Let's see, Birth and Main Street still moving forward with Snowfest hopefully. We've gotten over one hurdle, that was the snow gun. Now we're to, next hurdle's getting artists, so we're seeking out artists now. And then we're also planning the parade for November 26th, the lighted Christmas parade and the tree lighting in the park with Santa Claus. We've got about 10 people so far signed up for the parade. And we'll be doing some more activities during the day, to spark off the holiday shopping in our great downtown. There are a lot of neat stores down there, so hopefully we'll get lots of people downtown and we can try out that new software you guys got to see how many people actually make it down there.
It's pretty cool.
Nice.
So, and that is it.
That's it, cool. Youth Advisory wanted to come present to us sometime soon about the Scorch Fest and kind of what they learned. They're also re-recording information about the Matthew Yanitz Fund for distribution for high school students. Only other question I have for staff, email about a gentleman named James up kind of near the golf course. Apparently there's facilities guys up there that are like starting up chainsaws and whatever at like 4:40 in the morning. Didn't know what the story was on that, but he doesn't sound too terribly happy. I'm sure he'll tell us more about that here in less than 5 minutes. That's all I have for me. Attorney Smith, any reports from you?
I have nothing, Your Honor.
Okay, all right, less than 5 minutes, let's do it.
I do actually, I was half serious when I said I had a long list, so I'll pare it down. On the noise issue that went to the board, our neighborhood services officer Teresa reached out to him today. I'm sure she'll get connected and hopefully we can work out a solution with the golf course. The noise ordinances are primarily related to building, our construction site maintenance, noise time limits. Outside of that would be disturbing the peace. This is one of those interesting issues where the person complaining is not a town resident. This happened before Ursa Major. So it's a complicated situation, and it is a golf course facility, and they have to turn mowers on at 5 o'clock in the morning. Anyway, we'll work on it as best we can. There's a practical limitation of what we can do there. The Youth Advisory Commission, we're hoping to come before you on the 22nd. We have that on our current calendar, and I think Clerk Morris will be in contact with them if he hasn't been already. Our asphalt maintenance project is wrapping up. Mount Meeker was the last street that got repaired this year. That's the one in Gateway that does this. It's like a roller coaster. If you drive it now, it's pretty smooth. So really happy to see that get done. And then all the southern half of the Hillsdale subdivision, and then obviously the state streets we've talked about before. So another good successful asphalt season with a lot of repaving work done. The trail work should start on the Berthoud Parkway trail south of Spartan Avenue. That had been originally planned as part of our trail project north of Spartan on Berthoud Parkway. The developer of the Rose Farm Village then stockpiled a bunch of dirt on top of it. Then they agreed to pay for the trail. Then the trail got more expensive because everything got more expensive. Then we had to work out a deal to get it built as they got all their dirt and stuff out of the way. Anyway, I think it's finally gonna be under construction here before the end of the year.
Good.
So we're happy to see that final last little segment get complete. And when that's complete, then we'll have about a 3.5 mile loop of trail on the south end of town continuously. So that's pretty exciting. Trustee Hardy mentioned kicking off small business support. Our Walt Elish, our business development manager, and Cindy Leach, our finance director, are working on a little business support program. Not quite Berthoud Bucks, which is what we did in partnership with the chamber previously, but something very similar. And I'm excited about that program. Walt walked me through the plan today and sent me over kind of the initial stuff just before the meeting. But our hope would be that we'd kick that off right after Thanksgiving as part of Small Business Saturday, and that would continue on into December and would include prizes for folks that are shopping downtown and all kinds of cool stuff. So anyway, happy to see the staff working on that, putting that together. And I'll leave it there because it's exactly 10 o'clock.
Perfect, all right. Well, that's the meeting, folks. Have a good night.